You were taught to believe the world makes sense, that cause leads to effect, that systems are stable, and that somewhere behind all of it, there's an invisible blueprint holding it together. But what if that belief isn't truth, just maintenance, just enough glue to keep things from falling apart? What if reality isn't working, it's pretending to work? Look closely and you'll start to see the seams, thoughts that contradict themselves, systems that collapse the moment you question them, feelings that don't match your memories. It all moves forward, yes, but like a car coasting downhill with no engine, powered only by momentum and faith. This isn't a story about a world that's broken. It's a theory that suggests something far more unsettling, that the world is broken on purpose. Not by accident, not by chaos, but by design, and that your belief in its stability is the only thing keeping it from crumbling into nonsense. Now breathe, and come with me. We begin at the place where everything appears calm. But nothing is quite right. You wake each day inside a world that feels solid. The floor greets your feet, the same way it did yesterday. The walls still hold, gravity still pulls. There's breakfast in the fridge, a name you answer to, and clocks that pretend to mean something. But beneath all this comfort is a whisper you've trained yourself not to hear, a suspicion you buried long ago, that this thing you're living in might only look stable because you've been taught not to see the wobble. Stability is a performance, not a truth. It's the outward face of chaos that has learned to stand still just long enough for you to look away. Think of how often your thoughts contradict each other, how your memories revise themselves without permission, how time feels fast one day, slow the next, and yet the seconds on your watch never blink out of rhythm. The world insists that it's running smoothly, but the deeper you examine it, the more you find evidence of stitching, improvisation, patchwork. Buildings don't fall apart because we check their foundations. Societies don't collapse because people question their rules. They fall apart when the illusion that holds them together begins to flicker, and we notice, and most of the time that flicker is dismissed. You forget it, you brush it off, you convince yourself that it's not a pattern, but a one-time flaw. But what if it is a pattern? What if the cracks are not the exception, they're the architecture? Reality presents itself like a perfectly balanced sculpture, but you're never shown the scaffolding, the invisible agreements, the rules everyone's pretending to follow. A currency backed by confidence, not gold. A justice system built on belief, not fairness. A truth that depends on repetition, not verification. The moment you stop participating in the performance, the set begins to shake. Psychologists have long studied the mind's craving for cognitive closure, the desire to reach a stable conclusion, even if it's wrong, just to end the discomfort of not knowing. That same desire applies to your perception of reality. If something seems to function, you grant it legitimacy. You accept that what works must be true. You let the convenience of stability replace the discomfort of inquiry. But working and being real are not the same thing. Take dreams. In a dream, the world feels stable until it doesn't. You walk through streets that seem familiar but never existed. You speak languages you don't know. People appear, act, vanish, and none of it feels strange until you wake. The dream was stable only while you were asleep. It collapsed the moment you brought awareness to it. And what if the waking world behaves the same way? What if its sense of stability is held together by your passive agreement not to examine it too closely? Watch a magic trick, and the illusion holds, until you try to figure it out. Try to see the sleight of hand, and the trick dies. The illusion needs your trust to survive. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once said, "Civilization advances by extending the number of operations we can perform without thinking about them. But in that automation, something is lost. The ability to question the assumptions underneath the routines. You believe the sun will rise, your lungs will breathe, your phone will buzz with news, and the future will resemble the past, not because it's true, but because that belief allows you to function. The world hasn't earned your trust. It simply inherited it. But what if you paused, just long enough, to feel the wobble? The moment before a lie is discovered, the breath held between one reality and the next, the seconds before the curtain falls, and you see the strings. That sits where we are now, in a space that feels real enough to trust, but fragile enough to doubt. A world built on routines so consistent, they feel sacred. But consistency is not truth. It's just repetition. And as we move forward, one thread at a time, you may begin to wonder if this entire system is a house of mirrors held together not by truth, but by your willingness not to look too closely. You've seen machines sputter, choke, and still manage to function. A car that rattles but moves. A laptop that freezes but recovers. Systems, when observed closely, rarely operate with the elegance we imagine. And yet, they do just enough. Just enough to keep going. Just enough to seem dependable. Just enough to convince you that whatever's happening is what's supposed to happen. What if the entire universe operates on this principle? Not perfection, not precision, just enough. Look around. Systems are failing all the time. Healthcare, education, memory, attention, emotion, yet the illusion of functionality persists. The light turns green, the email sends, the coffee brews, the heart beats. You're not told everything's working perfectly. You're told that if it's working at all, it must be working correctly. That good enough is the same as true. But good enough is a disguise, a soft padded lie. The universe is full of processes that malfunction quietly, thoughts that misfire, memories that rewrite themselves, perceptions that contradict physics, yet never demand correction, because correction would expose the truth that behind the curtain, reality doesn't run clean code. It runs hacks, patches, temporary fixes. Evolution itself doesn't aim for perfection. It aims for survival, for just enough. A species doesn't need to be the strongest or the smartest, just better adapted than what came before. Your eyes have blind spots. Your brain fills them in. You don't see the error, so you trust the image. Your mind has biases, shortcuts for fast decisions. They aren't accurate, but they're efficient, enough to get by, enough to function, enough to feel real. That sips the trick. Reality doesn't need to be coherent. It only needs to appear coherent long enough for you to stop questioning it. This is the lie of competence, that things around you are designed to work, that nature makes sense, that the systems governing your life are optimized for truth. But look closer, and you'll see that most systems are legacies of accidents, workarounds, a chain of decisions made under pressure and patched with hope. And somehow, they keep running. This is what philosophers call satisficing, a term that combines satisfy and suffice. It describes the strategy of choosing something that's good enough, rather than the best. Reality satisfices. It doesn't optimize, it compromises, and then hides the compromise behind repetition, behind the familiar hum of routine. And because the outcome feels stable, you accept the method without inspection. The average person walks through the world mistaking regularity for reliability. If the streetlights work 10 nights in a row, you trust the 11th. If gravity holds, you expect it to keep holding. But what if this trust is not based on laws, only on habit? What if things hold together not because of some deep order, but because you haven't seen them fall apart yet? In software engineering, there's a term legacy code. It's code that still works, but no one remembers how. It's too risky to replace, too fragile to touch, so it's left alone, trusted blindly. The modern world is built on legacy code, in your computers, in your governments, in your beliefs. You trust it because it hasn't failed yet, not because you understand it. Apply that same idea to reality itself. What if the cosmos is built on a framework that just barely works? That responds to your observations but not consistently. That reacts to your expectations but only locally. What if particles behave one way when observed, and another when not, because the system can't handle constant precision? Quantum mechanics already hints at this. Particles that seem to change behavior based on observation, not because they're hiding truth, but because they're adapting to keep the illusion running, working, but only just enough. Think of your own body, your mind, your choices. You get through most days, not with mastery, but with guesswork, with memory fragments, with half-formed motivations. You act and then justify. You feel and then name the feeling. You don't live with precision, you live with approximation. And still, you call it consciousness. You call it life. Now imagine reality doing the same. Responding to your actions. Filling in the blanks. Improvising logic when you're not looking. Running just enough code to simulate depth, consistency, permanence. A simulated world doesn't need full detail, only what's in your view. A convincing lie doesn't need to be complete, only believable where it counts. If reality is pretending to work, then it would be wise, lazy, adaptive, and strangely familiar, because you do the same thing. You laugh at a joke you didn't understand, nod through a conversation you zoned out of, repeat stories whose origins you forgot. You survive by pretending to understand, to function, to know, not because you do, but because it's enough to pass. Now reverse that lens. What if the world is doing the same to you? What if, behind your expectations, the universe is improvising meaning, not offering truth, but offering just enough? Just enough to keep the simulation running. Just enough to keep your questions quiet. Just enough to feel like home, even when it isn't said. And if it all fell apart tomorrow, if gravity paused for a breath, if time reversed for a blink, if your thoughts collided in ways that broke your sense of self, would you even notice? Or would your mind patch the hole, rewrite the glitch, and move on? Would you say, that was strange, and forget it by lunch? Would you survive the malfunction by pretending it never happened? Because maybe that's what reality is doing too. You probably never noticed the stitching, the tiny seams in the fabric of your experience, the pieces that don't quite match, but are close enough that your mind lets them pass. The stranger who looked familiar, the memory that didn't fit the timeline, the feeling you've done this before, even though you haven't. These aren't glitches, they're stitches. Held not by precision, but by silence, by the fact that you don't look too closely. Reality doesn't come as one seamless thread. It's patchwork stitched together from sensations, beliefs, habits, and guesses. And the thread? It's your attention, your acceptance, your agreement to keep walking forward without pulling at what might unravel. The patchwork is quiet because it has to be. It can't shout. If it did, you'd notice the mismatched fabric. The illusion depends on your disinterest. Your senses are not perfect tools. Your eyes only see a sliver of the spectrum. Your ears filter out most of the world. Your brain doesn't give you reality. It gives you a version of reality it thinks is useful. It crops the image, rounds off the edges, colors in what's missing. You think you're experiencing the world, but you're experiencing a model, a version stitched just for you. And that model has gaps. But those gaps are filled in with confidence. You're not shown uncertainty. You're shown certainty that's convenient. The patchwork is masked by familiarity. Your apartment looks the same today as it did yesterday. But did you actually check? Did you scan every corner, count every object, verify every detail? Or did your brain reuse yesterday's map to save energy? Your brain is a master of inference. It fills in blanks automatically. The shadows in the hallway, the faces in a crowd, the unspoken parts of a sentence. You live in a predictive loop, constantly guessing, rarely checking. And in that guessing, reality has room to hide, to rearrange, to patch itself anew without needing to inform you. You only see what you expect to see. The rest is rendered invisible. Not because it's absent, but because it doesn't fit the quilt you've already accepted. A man named Hermann von Helmholtz once said that perception is unconscious inference, that every act of seeing is a prediction, and when the prediction is wrong, your mind quietly corrects it. You don't notice the change. You absorb it as if it was always there. The patchwork shifts silently beneath your awareness, and you call it continuity. But what if the patchwork isn't a product of your perception? What if reality itself is the one making the quiet guesses, adjusting, updating, fixing what it needs to, just enough to keep you convinced? Imagine a painter working in secret. Every time you blink, she adjusts the canvas, smooths a brush stroke, hides a mistake, fills in a missing piece before your eyes reopen. You never catch her, but the changes are there, and your mind, not wanting conflict, simply assumes it was always that way. Now, stretch that metaphor outward. What if this entire world is that canvas, constantly edited, repainted, rearranged to match your expectations, or more disturbingly, to match the limits of your attention? The philosopher Donald Hoffman argues that perception evolved not to show us truth, but to help us survive. That what we see isn't the real world, but a user interface. Like icons on a computer screen, they don't show us what's really inside the computer, just what we need to function. So what if reality is just that? A functional interface, a patchwork skin stretched over unknowable machinery. It doesn't matter what's underneath, only that the surface is convincing enough to keep you playing the game. You don't need to know how electricity works to use a light switch. You don't need to understand consciousness to feel pain. You don't need truth, just the appearance of it. And so, reality delivers that, not because it is truth, but because it works. Until it doesn't. And then what? When the patchwork slips, when you hear your name whispered in an empty room, when time stutters, when the radio plays a song that answers your thoughts, do you ask why? Or do you smooth the fabric back down? Call it coincidence, fatigue, imagination. Do you rejoin the script and pretend the gap was never there? You probably do. Because questioning the patchwork means accepting that what you stand on isn't solid. It means admitting that your memories may be sewn together, that your identity might be a threadbare garment you've worn for years without checking the label, that your future is being stitched in real time by a pattern you'll never see. And yet, here you are, sitting inside it, wrapped in it, carried by it. A tapestry that feels complete, but reveals loose ends when the light hits just right. What does that mean for your choices? For your sense of cause and effect? For the stories you tell yourself about who you are? Perhaps you are not living a truth, but a well-maintained patch. A version of reality that sips working not because it sips whole, but because it's been mended quietly, over and over again. And maybe, just maybe, you've been taught not to notice the thread. You think in loops more often than you realize. You believe you're following a line, a thought, a reason, a conclusion. But more often than not, the path circles back. The end becomes the start. The answer becomes the question. And you call that logic. You call that progress. But maybe it's just motion disguised as meaning. Because if the destination keeps leading you back to the beginning, was there ever a direction at all? Let's begin where all logic claims to begin, with assumptions, foundations, axioms. The truths you don't question because you need something to stand on. You're told that logic is a pure machine, an objective force, that if you feed it valid truths, it will deliver conclusions with certainty. But what if the truths you feed it were born from the same loop it's meant to solve? What if logic isn't a path to truth, but a reflection of your own boundaries? When you say, if A then B, you've already decided what A is, you've already set the terms, and once B appears, the logic feels complete. You nod, you trust the loop. But where did A come from? Who placed it there? Was it a result of experience? Culture? A repetition you heard so many times it hardened into fact? The mind loves circles. You justify your behavior by your identity. Then you justify your identity by your behavior. You believe you stir good because you do good things. But you do good things because you believe you're good. Round and round. You fear rejection, so you act guarded. Your guardedness pushes people away. You get rejected, and believe your fear was justified. Round and round. You search for meaning in life. Find a belief system that feels right, and then interpret every event through that belief, which confirms its truth, making you feel that meaning was always there. Round and round. This is logic, but logic isn't immune to illusion. In fact, it thrives in it. Philosophers have long struggled with what's called a closed system, a system that defines itself, explains itself, and never admits anything outside its own terms. Religious dogma can be one. So can science, if clung to with blind faith. So can your personal narratives, your trauma loops, your self-worth spirals. These systems feel airtight, impressive, but they're not truth. They're recursive stability. Self-sustaining circuits that feel logical because they never step outside their own borders. But if you never leave the loop, how do you know there sips anything else? The logician Kurt Gödel shattered the world of mathematics with this insight, that any system complex enough to describe the world will always contain statements that are true, but unprovable within the system itself. In other words, you can't solve a loop from inside the loop, you need something outside it. But what if there is no outside? What if consciousness itself is the loop? What if this moment, you're listening, you're questioning, is just the system folding in on itself again? You hear these thoughts, and they feel original. But they come from within the same maze of neural wiring, from memories built on patterns, from language shaped by history, from logic that loops, even your perception of time loops. The past shapes your thoughts interpret the past, and the future is imagined using both. You don't move in straight lines. You orbit. Even stories, the way you organize your life, are loops disguised as lines. The hero returns home, the villain becomes the victim. The problem solved gives birth to another. Nothing ends cleanly. It folds. You've seen it. You've lived it. Think of the last time you tried to solve a problem, only to find yourself creating another. The last time a solution felt eerily similar to the problem it was meant to fix. The last time you tried to escape something, only to meet it again in a new shape. That sips not coincidence. That sips the loop. Even your need for meaning comes in circles. You ask why until you're exhausted. You arrive at something that feels true. You rest there until rest becomes restless again, and the questions return. So here steps the question. Is reality logical, or is logic just the way you survive the noise? Is logic the structure of the universe, or the scaffolding your mind builds to not fall apart? Because if logic always leads you back to your starting point, if every therefore turns into another, but what if each breakthrough only deepens the paradox, then maybe reality isn't set built on logic. Maybe it only borrows its clothes, and underneath, it sets wearing something softer, looser, unfinished. A system that makes just enough sense to keep you from panicking. A language that folds in on itself. A mirror reflecting another mirror, and calling that proof. Because what is a loop, really? It stips safety. It stips familiarity. It sets the comfort of returning. And maybe logic isn't set broken. Maybe it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Not to deliver truth, but to keep you thinking just long enough to stay inside. You've been taught that consistency is a virtue, that it means strength, integrity, order. But what if it's not? What if consistency is a costume, a mask that reality wears to appear more trustworthy than it is? Everything around you whispers the same message. This is how it's always been. The sun rises, the coffee brews, the traffic light changes from red to green to red again. Your name stays the same, your body mostly obeys. The world feels like a machine. Precise, clockwork, dependable. But underneath that rhythm, cracks run deep. You see them when things go wrong, when a person snaps for no reason, when the weather forgets its season, when memories change shape without permission. The performance of consistency falters, and for a second you glimpse what's underneath. Improvisation, fragility, fabrication. Because consistency isn't natural, it's manufactured. Your brain loves patterns. It hunts for them, even when none exist. That's how you find shapes in clouds and faces in shadows. It's how you turn chaos into story, randomness into narrative, coincidence into fate. You don't just notice patterns, you invent them. And once a pattern is noticed, your mind holds onto it like a lifeline, even if it isn't real. Especially if it isn't real, because the alternative, a world of endless unpredictability, is too unbearable. So you wear the mask, and you expect reality to wear one too. But what if it accepts only pretending? Think of déjà vu, the feeling you've been here before, that moment when the present folds into the past, and for a second, everything feels scripted, familiar, glitched. Déjà vu isn't proof of a repeated event. It's proof that your mind values recognition over truth, that it will invent consistency to avoid dissonance. Even language plays along. You speak in familiar phrases, say, "I'm fine," when you're not. Repeat social scripts like passwords. You signal stability, not because you are stable, but because others expect you to be. You become predictable to fit into a world that rewards masks over messiness. And so, we all perform. Reality too begins to mirror this performance. It gives you what you expect, or close enough. Your beliefs shape perception. Perception confirms belief. It sips not that the world is consistent. It stats that you stopped noticing where it is instead. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that supports your existing views and ignore what doesn't. You build a self-reinforcing loop, one that feels consistent because you've removed all contradictions. But remove the mask, and you'll see contradictions everywhere. The same person can be loving and cruel. The same idea can free and imprison. The same event can be remembered in 100 ways. None of them true, and all of them valid. Reality doesn't owe you consistency. It only owes you experience. And experience is slippery. Think of the moon. It looks the same from Earth, every night, a glowing constant. But in truth, it's shifting, rotating, wobbling. Its face only appears still because of tidal locking, a coincidence of motion. You call it consistent because it doesn't change in the ways you can easily see. Now apply that to everything. Your routines, your history, your identity. What if they only appear stable because the angle hasn't changed? You believe you're the same person you were last week, but you aren't. Not entirely. New thoughts, new cells, slight shifts in preference. You speak with the same voice, wear the same name, but the self behind the eyes flickers. Still, you pretend, and reality pretends back. Even physics, that last bastion of certainty, is filled with contradictions. Particles behave like waves. Time may not flow forward. Constants might not be constant. The universe expands into something, or nothing, or maybe it loops. Scientists smooth the data, remove outliers, build models that fit what they can measure. They wear the mask of consistency, because without it, there is only confusion, and confusion, while honest, is hard to fund. So where does this leave you? Trapped in a system that must pretend to be consistent, because if it admitted its fractures, everything would collapse. Meaning, morality, memory, choice. But maybe collapse isn't set the end. Maybe behind the mask is something more beautiful. A reality that doesn't follow straight lines, but dances in spirals. A self that doesn't need to match yesterday's version, but is reborn in every moment. A truth that isn't rigid, but alive. You don't need to fear inconsistency. You already live in it. You already survive it. Every night you die a little in your sleep, and every morning you wake pretending nothing changed. But everything does. And that sip's okay? So, take off the mask. Let the contradictions breathe. Let your thoughts wander. Let the loop break for just a second. Because maybe the most honest version of reality isn't the one that sips consistent, but the one that admits it's wearing a mask too. Some things in life don't scream at you with clarity. They whisper, just loud enough to feel meaningful, just quiet enough to escape inspection. You nod along, you fill in the blanks, and before you know it, you've made peace with something that almost makes sense. And almost is often good enough. You do it every day, the glance from a stranger that lingers too long, a coincidence that feels too sharp to ignore, a memory that aligns too perfectly with your current mood. Your brain doesn't ask for proof. It asks for story, meaning, pattern, resolution. And if what you encounter offers even the slightest structure, the faintest coherence, you accept it. Reality doesn't need to be precise to be persuasive. It just needs to hint at logic, suggest order, offer a breadcrumb trail that could lead somewhere, even if it loops back to nothing. That's how belief works. Not certainty, just plausibility. Your mind is a machine designed not to detect truth, but to construct believability. You're not a seeker of facts, you're a builder of narratives. And narratives don't need to be flawless. They need to be familiar, self-contained, and just strong enough to withstand casual questioning. If something almost makes sense, you fill in the rest with trust. Think of dreams again. In dreams, impossible things happen. You fly, you breathe underwater, you speak languages you don't know, and yet, in the moment, it all feels right, because the dream doesn't explain everything. It just gives you a framework, a mood, a rhythm. It gives you almost, and your brain, desperate for a shape to hold, completes the illusion. Now imagine waking life doing the same thing, giving you almost truths, almost reasons, almost patterns. Like a movie where the plot holes are masked by emotion. You're so immersed in the feeling that you don't notice the logic failing. Or maybe you do, but you don't care. You want the experience, not the audit, so you stay inside it. Reality may work the same way. It offers partial coherence, logic, in doses, equations that solve only when you don't stare too hard. You walk through it with the quiet understanding that most things function, and those that don't, they're dismissed as exceptions, anomalies, background noise. But what if those exceptions are the truth? What if reality only pretends to make sense, because total nonsense would unravel you? This is the paradox. The closer you look, the more unstable things appear. Quantum physics tells us that particles behave like waves until measured. That information can exist in superpositions. That time may not flow, it may flicker, rewind, hesitate. These aren't side effects. They're fundamental. And yet, the world around you seems fine. Tables are solid, clocks tick forward, gravity pulls. It all makes just enough sense to be convincing. So you stop asking, but almost leaves a trail. It sips in the way people change their memories to fit how they feel now, the way history books simplify centuries into paragraphs, The way your beliefs survive by forgetting the contradictions that once threatened them. You don't build your life on certainty. You build it on close enough. And close enough can be dangerous. Because it allows you to trust systems that weren't designed for truth, only for appearance. You vote in elections without knowing the algorithms behind the ballots. You believe scientific papers without reading the data. You trust your own thoughts without questioning where they came from. You think, I feel it, so it must be true. But feelings are echoes, refractions of previous feelings, loops pretending to be conclusions. And when those loops circle back with just enough logic, just enough familiarity, you accept them, not because they're airtight, but because they're comfortable. This is the tragedy of intelligence. The smarter the system, the better it becomes at rationalizing. You don't remove confusion, you organize it. You don't eliminate chaos, you narrate it. You don't solve the world, you make it sound solved. Almost makes sense is a lullaby. A quiet reassurance that lets you fall asleep inside contradiction. And most of the time, it sits harmless. Until you start building important things on it. Your identity. Your relationships. Your fears. What if you sip not who you think you are? What if that sip's just the most convenient version? What if love isn't as clean as you describe it? But you edit out the messy parts to keep the story alive? What if your goals were inherited, not chosen, but you retrofitted a narrative to make them feel personal? This is what almost does. It allows you to live without collapse, but also without awareness. You walk through a world of approximations, and you become one too. Not a whole truth, just a convincing version. Reality offers you its mask, and you wear it back. So here we are, surrounded by things that nearly make sense. Timelines that mostly hold together. People who kind of understand each other. You don't ask for perfection. You ask for continuity. You don't want truth. You want truthiness. A shape that resembles truth. Feels like it. Tastes like it. But collapses when held too long. And maybe that sip's enough. Maybe that's how reality survives. By never letting you hold it for too long. By dancing just out of reach. Wearing a costume of logic. And leaving you to fill in the rest. Almost. Some truths feel fragile. They don't sit like solid stone in your mind. They hang there, barely balanced. Held not by evidence, not by certainty, but by something more improvised. Something temporary. Something that feels like duct tape. There's a certain kind of truth that survives, not because it's undeniable, but because no one has bothered to question it loudly enough. It's held together by repetition, convenience and silence, like a broken shelf that still holds books, only because you've learned to place them carefully. You tell yourself it's fine, as long as you don't shake it, as long as you don't touch it, as long as you pretend it's not falling apart. And maybe the same is true of reality. What if the truths that make up your world, the ones you live by, trust, teach, and fight for, are being held together by psychological tape, by assumptions patched over with habits, by stories repeated so often they've hardened into facts? Think of how many beliefs you've inherited without inspection. Not just religious or political ones, but personal ones, who you are, what you're capable of, what success looks like, what love is supposed to feel like. These are not truths you discovered, they're truths you were handed. Some of them worked, others didn't, but you kept them because they made the structure feel complete. Even if the foundation was soft, even if the seams were visible, even if parts of it were peeling off. Still, you call it true, because it's been there so long, you stop checking. Your sense of identity is one of the most duct-taped truths of all. You believe you're a consistent self, a stable presence moving through time, but that belief requires an enormous amount of maintenance. You have to ignore your contradictions, reinterpret your past, and organize your inner chaos into a shape that feels familiar. You patch over confusion with explanation. You tape down uncertainty with routine. You stitch together memory with emotion, and then tell yourself that sip's who you are. But who are you really? A person? A name? A collection of experiences? Or are you simply the current configuration of patched-together truths, rearranged daily to survive? Even science, the gold standard of truth, is not immune to tape. Every major paradigm shift in history came by tearing through the tape of a previous truth. The Earth doesn't orbit the Sun. Taped down. the atom is indivisible. Taped, time is absolute. Taped, minds are separate from bodies. Taped and painted over for centuries. And every time a new truth emerged, it wasn't because the old one was quietly folded away. It was torn, violently. The tape came undone. People resisted, fought, denied, because removing the tape risks collapse. It risks exposing that the entire system of truth was never nailed down. It was stuck together, adjusted, patched, and painted, just enough to seem whole. But maybe truth isn't meant to be permanent. Maybe truth isn't a sculpture. Maybe it's scaffolding. Maybe what you call truth is just a temporary structure meant to hold you up long enough to reach the next platform. And maybe the tape isn't a flaw. Maybe it's the only reason you're still standing. Look around your own life. How many of your beliefs are built on what once helped you cope? Maybe you learned not to trust others after a betrayal, and that became a rule, a truth. Maybe you decided you weren't good enough after one failure, and that idea hardened into identity. Maybe you survived something you never talk about, and the silence became a support beam. You built a life around those taped truths, and now they keep the ceiling from falling. But what if you don't need them anymore? What if the tape that once held you together is now holding you back? And even deeper than that, what if reality itself, the rules of matter, time, space, memory, are being held together in the same way, not by laws, but by workarounds, by temporary fixes to permanent problems, by duct tape you've forgotten is even there? A scientist once joked that if the universe were designed, it would have been recalled by now. The code is messy. The physics are weird. The constants aren't constant. Everything works, but barely. It's almost as if the cosmos was jury-rigged just well enough to survive inspection, but not deep inquiry. And when you look too close, things start to fall apart. You notice that time doesn't flow the same way in dreams. That memory edits itself in real time. That two people can live the same event and walk away with opposite truths. And yet the world goes on, held together by trust, expectation, and cognitive duct tape. Because the truth isn't what's out there. It sips what holds the system together, even if it's fraying, even if it peels at the edges, even if you don't still want to look. So here sips the question, are you living inside something real, or something patched? And if the answer is patched, does that make it less meaningful, or more? Because maybe the fact that everything still stands, despite the wear, despite the improvisation, despite the peeling seams, is instead a sign of weakness, but of quiet genius. Of a system so adaptable, it can survive its own flaws. A truth so flexible, it can hold you, even when nothing else can. So keep watching. Keep feeling for the edges. Because what sits behind the tape might not be destruction. It might be the start of something even more real. The machine works. That's what you're told. That's what you see. The traffic light turns green. The faucet gives water. The screen lights up when you tap it. The body wakes when the sun rises. It all functions, so you assume it must be correct. It must be well designed, complete. But what if that's the greatest illusion of all? What if function is instead proof of perfection, but camouflage for the flaws hiding beneath? You wouldn't call a leaky boat seaworthy just because it's floating for now. You wouldn't say a chair is well built just because it hasn't collapsed yet. But that's how most of reality operates, broken in places you can't see, but just stable enough to earn your trust. The cracks exist. The flaws are real, but they don't scream. They don't announce themselves. They wait, quietly, beneath every structure, every pattern, every belief you've come to depend on. And because the outcome seems fine, you never think to question the architecture. But function doesn't mean flawlessness. It just means failure hasn't happened yet. Look at your own body. Your spine wasn't designed for upright walking. It's a compromise. A fragile column inherited from creatures who walked on all fours. It works, but barely. Your knees, prone to degeneration. Your eyes, wired backwards. Your brain, a tangled evolutionary mess of instincts and logic fighting for control. And yet, it works. That's the dangerous part. Because when something works, you stop looking for what sits broken. You call it normal, natural, necessary. But what you really mean is, I learned how to live with it. Now stretch that lens outward. Look at your relationships. How many function, but only because you've stopped touching certain subjects. How many depend on unspoken rules, invisible compromises, little fictions that hold the thing together? Is that love? Or is it architecture made of silence? What about your career? Your goals? Do they function because they're aligned with who you are? Or because you've learned how to ignore the discomfort long enough to stay on track? Function can be deceiving. It can become the perfect excuse not to dig deeper. Why fix what is incept broken? But here sits the secret. Everything is a little bit broken. And some things survive because of their flaws. Japanese artists have a concept called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. The flaw becomes the highlight. The break is part of the story. It's not erased, it's celebrated. But most of the world hides its cracks, covers them with paint, polishes the surface, tells you it was never broken. And you believe it, because the machine still runs. But if you looked underneath, you'd see that so many of the systems you trust are held together by outdated code, obsolete assumptions, and layers of improvisation. The legal system, built on centuries-old logic designed for a world that no longer exists. Education, a factory model from the industrial era. Healthcare, advanced technology layered over deeply human bottlenecks. They function, but they are flawed. Deeply, repeatedly, predictably. And those flaws shape outcomes. Shape lives. Shape you. Because function, left unquestioned, becomes myth. You start to believe that anything functional must be good, that if it delivers a result it must be right. But that's how you end up trusting algorithms that reinforce bias, systems that perpetuate inequality, technologies that solve the wrong problem but look impressive doing it. A bridge can stand for years until it doesn't. A lie can work for decades until it can sit. A routine can carry you until you wake up and wonder whose life you're living. So ask yourself, what in your world is functioning only because you've stopped testing its foundation? What beliefs are you carrying that only seem true because they've never been challenged? What parts of your identity are held together by habits that once protected you, but now confine you? The flaw behind function is rarely obvious. It sits hidden in the inertia of repetition, the same way a song plays in your head, not because it's beautiful, but because it's familiar. The same way a habit forms, not because it's right, but because it's repeated. The same way a worldview survives, not because it holds truth, but because it functions well enough. But good enough is not the same as good, and working is not the same as wise. So what happens when you begin to notice the flaws? Not to panic, but to pay attention. Not to rip everything apart, but to ask, what part of this was built for a different time? What part was never meant to last this long? What part have I mistaken for truth, when it was only convenience? You may find that some things, once exposed, fall apart, but others reveal something deeper, something more human. The flaw becomes the window, the crack becomes the question, the break becomes the beginning, because behind every flawless surface is a truth you've never touched. And sometimes, it's only through the flaw that the light gets in. So don't trust things just because they function. Trust what reveals itself when it doesn't set. Trust the broken conversation, the uncomfortable thought, the tear in the pattern, because that sips where the story lives. And maybe that sips where reality stops pretending. A system is supposed to be solid, predictable, repeatable. That's why we build them. To create order out of the noise, to turn chaos into steps, into flowcharts, into something that can be understood and trusted. But if you dig deep enough into any system, political, social, scientific, even personal, you'll find something strange at the bottom. You one sight find truth. You shall find an assumption. A quiet, just because. A silent, we stiff, always done it this way. A shrug, buried beneath layers of logic. And yet, the entire system rests on it. Everything above is built like scaffolding around that fragile, unquestioned core. Because systems don't begin with facts. They begin with decisions. Someone somewhere decided that this would be the rule, that this would be the value, that this would be considered true, or useful, or sacred. And the rest was constructed from there. Not proven, just agreed upon. Take language. There's no reason a certain sound should mean tree, or home, or love. It's not logical, it's social. You didn't choose the words you use, you inherited them, and through them, you inherited a worldview, a way of framing reality. That SIP's an assumption, disguised as fluency. Take time. We divide it into hours, minutes, decades. We say it moves forward, that it's linear, that it passes. But physics suggests time might not be a river at all. It might be a landscape, static, looped, fragmented. The idea that time moves is a useful story, not a law. We assume it, because it helps us function. It gives us goals, deadlines, regret, hope. That SIP's an assumption, disguised as progress. Even your sense of self is a system, a bundle of memories, sensations, preferences, stitched together and called you. But who decided which memories counted? Which voices in your head got to speak louder? Which impulses were labeled good or bad? You did. Or someone did, long ago. And that was an assumption disguised as identity. The deeper you look, the more you see it. Laws based on assumptions about human nature. Economies built on assumptions about value. Science built on assumptions about observation. Morality built on assumptions about consciousness. And still, the systems function. They guide your days, shape your thoughts, govern entire civilizations. But functioning isn't the same as founded. Structure isn't set the same as stability. Because once the assumption at the bottom is questioned, the whole thing can shift. That's why revolutions feel so destabilizing. They don't just protest the surface. They dig under the foundation and ask, who decided this was how the world should be? And suddenly, the entire scaffolding trembles. But this doesn't just happen in politics. It happens in your mind. You build systems all the time, for love, for work, for meaning. You create rules for how the world works, how people should act, how you must behave to earn connection or approval. These rules feel sacred, but they are often built on assumptions. That love should feel a certain way. That success looks like productivity. That pain must always be hidden. That you're not enough unless someone else says so. You rarely notice these assumptions. They stir silent, but they determine everything above them. The structure of your life is not just shaped by what you know. It's shaped by what you assume without realizing it. And sometimes, you defend the system even after it stops serving you. Because to admit the base was flawed would be to admit that all those years, all those choices, all that effort was built on sand. But maybe it was. And maybe that SIP's okay. Because systems aren't evil. They are necessary. We need ways to organize the mess. To survive the noise. To move forward. But what happens when the assumptions at the center no longer fit? Do you patch the system? Do you ignore the crack? Or do you dare to rebuild? Sometimes it starts small. You realize that the way you've always responded to stress, withdrawal, panic, anger, isn't truth. It's a learned reaction. An assumption that emotion equals danger. A rule you never wrote, but followed anyway. And in that moment, the scaffolding creaks. Or maybe you notice a story you tell yourself. That you always ruin things. That you are unlovable. That good things don't stay to last. And for the first time you ask, who gave me that assumption? And why did I believe them? And the structure begins to shift. The illusion of permanence fades. And what you are left with is possibility. Because when you remove the assumption, you don't fall into nothing. You fall into freedom. The freedom to rewrite the rules. To construct a new system, one that's conscious, chosen, alive. A system that works not because it hides its roots, but because it knows them. So look closely. Ask what each belief is built on. Ask who benefits from the structure. Ask what SIP's holding the foundation in place. Because it might not be fact. It might be a story, an echo, a choice someone else made, a long time ago. And you've been living inside it ever since. But you don't have to. You can ask. You can shift. You can let the old scaffolding fall. And in the silence that follows, you might discover a different kind of truth. One not built on assumptions, but on awareness. You'd think that once something cracks, it's ruined, shattered, done for. But reality seems to allow a stranger version of survival. One where cracks don't just exist, but behave. They stay within boundaries. They don't spread unless you push too hard. They let the illusion continue, as long as you agree not to press against the edges. This is the secret bargain. Reality doesn't need to be flawless. It only needs to keep its fractures polite. You've seen this in buildings, where foundations shift but don't collapse. In relationships, where wounds fester but no one speaks of them. In societies where injustice lives just beneath the surface, but the surface still shines. The cracks are there, but they behave. And so, you pretend they're not there at all. Why? Because it's easier to accept a quiet flaw than confront the collapse that might follow. You learn to live with fractures. You paint over them. You build routines around them. You forget where they are, as long as they don't scream. But silence doesn't mean strength. It only means cooperation. And sometimes, cracks cooperate so well, they become part of the structure. Think of old furniture, warped but steady. The creak in the step you never fix. The chip in the bowl that never cuts. Flaws absorbed into function. Cracks that learned their place. And as long as they stay within that place, the system feels whole. But what if reality works the same way? What if the cracks in logic, memory, identity, perception, the ones you notice, then ignore, are not malfunctions but features, designed not to be fixed, but to test your willingness to notice? Take memory. It's cracked. Deeply. Studies show that each time you recall something, you edit it, and yet, your memories rarely spiral out of control. They degrade in structured ways, predictable ways. The brain knows how much to blur before the illusion holds. The crack behaves. Or time. You've felt its strange shifts. Moments that drag, hours that vanish. Time isn't a constant in your experience. It bends, but it doesn't shatter. It plays within limits. It loops in dreams, stutters in trauma, accelerates in joy, and yet, the calendar still turns. You still age in a line. The crack behaves. Even your thoughts. They contradict. You believe two opposing things about yourself. You want two impossible outcomes. You act against your own values. The mind splits but doesn't fall apart. Somehow your consciousness holds together, not in spite of the fracture, but through it. Because the crack follows rules. It exists in the system, and the system adapts. You think of a crack as a threat, a break in integrity, a precursor to collapse. But sometimes, cracks are signs of flexibility, the system's way of absorbing pressure without snapping. They're a release valve, a way to say, this is holding, but just barely. You don't always need to fix the crack. You need to understand it. Because cracks carry messages. They tell you what the system can no longer hold. What truths have grown too heavy. What stories no longer fit. And sometimes, the crack isn't set in the world. It sits in your vision of it. You expected perfection, and got humanity. You wanted certainty, and found paradox. You chased logic, and met chaos disguised as meaning. But the system didn't spade break. It flexed. It groaned. It cracked, and continued. Isn't that strange? That the illusion can tolerate damage? That the map still works, even when parts of it are missing? It makes you wonder what else is broken, but functioning. What else you've accepted, simply because the cracks haven't demanded your attention. Maybe that sips the quiet trick of reality. It doesn't erase the flaws. It disciplines them. Keeps them in the corners. Hides them in sleep. Lets them show just enough to keep you unsure, but not enough to stop the performance. A glitch in a dream that resets before you question it. A shadow in the room that disappears when you turn the light on. A belief that falters only in silence. But you never stay in silence long enough to hear the rupture. Because you're not supposed to. You're supposed to keep moving. Keep believing. Keep trusting the parts that still work. Because if the crack behaves, then maybe it was never a crack at all. Maybe it sits just the seam between two truths. One that sips fading. One that hasn't arrived yet. And you stir standing on the line between them. So here sips the question. What happens when the crack no longer cooperates? When it widens, whispers louder, refuses to close? Do you panic? Do you patch it? Or do you listen? Do you sit with it long enough to learn what it's been holding back? Because maybe that crack isn't your enemy. Maybe it sits the system's most honest part. The only place where the mask slips. Where the pretense fails. Where the truth, raw and trembling, reaches through. A flaw, yes, but one that lets you see beyond the script. And if you follow it, if you trace the fracture, you might discover that what you called reality was never a smooth surface to begin with. It was always a cracked mirror, reflecting just enough to keep you from looking behind it. Until now, reality likes to perform, not always truthfully, but convincingly. It steps onto the stage of your perception each day, dressed in continuity, lit by memory and choreographed with precision. And like a seasoned actor, it never breaks character unless you catch it in the wings, unless you see the script before the scene is done. You call it coherence. You say, things make sense. But what if they only make sense because they've been rehearsed? What if reality doesn't possess coherence? It performs it. There sips a difference. To possess coherence is to be fundamentally aligned, seamless, self-contained. But to perform coherence is to look complete from the front, even if chaos is pacing just behind the curtain. Think of how often you witness contradictions in the world. A person who preaches kindness, then acts with cruelty. A rule that changes depending on who it applies to. A law that claims objectivity, but carries bias. These aren't anomalies. They're signs that the performance is ongoing. That coherence is being mimicked, not embodied. And you do it too. How many times have you smiled while breaking inside? Agreed while disagreeing? Told a story you no longer believe in, just to keep the scene intact? You are not lying. You are cohering. You are maintaining the illusion that everything is fine. Because that illusion holds power. Coherence buys trust. Trust allows survival. And survival becomes more important than truth. The mind is not built to see everything. It's built to see enough. Enough to make sense of the world. Enough to move through it without crumbling. If reality handed you its raw data, all the contradictions, the simultaneity, the infinite branching, you would freeze, collapse. So instead you're given the summary, the edit, the performance. Your senses are the stage. Your expectations, the lighting. And what you call truth might just be good acting. In psychology, this phenomenon has a name, narrative coherence. It's the tendency to organize experiences into stories that feel continuous, even if they aren't. You remember events not as they happened, but as they should have happened, to preserve a sense of identity, logic, purpose. If something doesn't fit, it gets rewritten. If it resists clarity, it gets smoothed out. If it threatens the story, it gets buried. You don't record reality. You direct it. Even your dreams follow this logic. They invent scenes out of fragments. They place meaning where none existed. And when you wake, you feel like the dream made sense, until you try to explain it. Because coherence doesn't need to be complete. It only needs to feel complete. That sips how magicians work. They don't trick you with what's there, they trick you with what you think should be there. The sleight of hand doesn't hide the truth. It weaponizes your expectations. Reality may do the same. Because coherence makes you feel safe. And safety keeps you from questioning. The systems you trust, logic, science, language, law, are all built to give you coherence. Not because coherence is always possible, but because the absence of it feels like danger, and humans avoid danger, even if it means clinging to a beautiful lie. A lie that looks like understanding. So ask yourself, when something makes sense, what does that actually mean? Does it mean it aligns with evidence? Or does it mean it aligns with what you already believe? Does it mean it sits complete? Or just unthreatening? When a story wraps up neatly, do you trust it more because it's true? Or because it's satisfying? This is the problem with the performance of coherence. It encourages belief without depth. It rewards smoothness over substance. It values narrative over nuance. But coherence can be faked, and often is. History books edit timelines. News stories filter details. You curate your identity. Your brain fills in blind spots. Your heart rewrites motives. And still, the performance continues. Because it needs to. Reality can't afford to look fragmented. Because then the audience might leave. So the cracks are swept backstage. The inconsistencies are muffled. And what remains is a polished version of the world. Not real, but presentable. And here sits the strange part. Even knowing this, you still applaud. Because coherence feels good. Even when you know it sips not the whole truth. Even when the scene is stitched together from spare parts, you say, "That was beautiful." Maybe that sits not weakness. Maybe it sits mercy. Because coherence, even if artificial, gives you a place to stand, a line to follow, a shape to hold, and maybe that sip's enough. But still, the question lingers. What lies beyond the performance? What happens if the actor breaks character? If the curtain lifts? If the lights flicker and the illusion stutters? Would you panic? Or would you finally see? Because the chaos behind the coherence, the randomness behind the rhythm, the truth behind the act, might not be terrifying. It might be liberating. It might reveal that you don't need the script anymore, that you can step off the stage into something messier, realer, quieter. Not the performance of coherence, but the stillness of what is. What if perfection arrives not by design, but by accident? You expect perfection to be designed, crafted with intention, the result of order, control, symmetry, and reason. But what if the most perfect things you've ever experienced weren't meant to happen? A glance that becomes a love story, a missed turn that becomes a new life, a moment of silence that opens something inside you. These aren't engineered. They happen in the gaps, in the in-between. They arrive when the system slips, and in the slip something more beautiful appears. A line stuttered with emotion. A song played slightly off-beat. You're told to aim for flawlessness, to perfect your path, to control your outcomes. But the more you control, the more artificial it feels. The more precise you become, the less alive it becomes. Because perfection, real perfection, is often born of the unscripted. They were mistakes that revealed something deeper. A photo blurred, just enough to feel real. These moments weren't set, planned. Maybe the systems you live inside weren't perfectly made. Maybe the symmetry you see is coincidence. Maybe the sense you find in the world is retrofitted. You apply meaning after the fact. And the things that resonate the most, the moments that shift you, aren't clean but raw, not flawless, but accidental. You call them serendipity. And maybe reality works the same way. You've probably experienced it before. The strange way things click into place when you stop trying. The way creativity flows, only when you stop reaching for control. The way healing begins the moment you let go of the narrative. You call them miracles. But maybe they sit just reality, being honest. It starts not because you finally got it right. It sits because you allowed the mistake to breathe. Because sometimes the mistake is the truth. Fractals too. Patterns that appear chaotic but repeat at every scale. Order within disorder. Mistakes that form a deeper structure. It's not perfection because it was imposed. It's perfection because it emerged. Consider nature. It's filled with asymmetry. Trees don't grow straight. Rivers don't flow in perfect lines. Clouds don't repeat themselves. But in that chaos, you see beauty. Not in spite of the imperfection, because of it. And emergence is messy. It starts not built. It unfolds. Like evolution, a billion accidents, most of them failures, that happen to produce life. Not because it was meant to, because it could. Because the conditions said yes long enough for something improbable to stabilize. That sips perfection by mistake. You weren't sit designed, you were arrived at. A long series of near disasters that resulted in this. A body that mostly works. And in that mostly, there is a strange kind of perfection. A mind that mostly makes sense. A life that mostly functions. Not the kind that impresses. The kind that couldn't have been planned better. The kind that surprises. Think of your own journey. The version of you that you admire, that you call strong, wise, evolved, didn't come from getting everything right. It came from the rupture, from the moment things didn't go as planned, the heartbreak, the failure, the wrong door that opened into something new. Because it wasn't set planned at all. You didn't find perfection in the map. You spend your life chasing control, chasing plans, chasing the idea that if you just arrange things correctly, everything will fall into place. But it rarely does. The plans unravel, the steps blur, and yet, something good still arrives. That sips the paradox. You found it in the detour. It just needs you to be available when it gets weirdly right. Because reality doesn't need you to get it right. Why? To feel the pattern in the disorder. It needs you to see the beauty in the misfire. To witness the perfect timing of something that wasn't supposed to happen. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "You're under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago, and that's the heart of it. You're allowed to change direction, to make a mistake, to discover a better version of your life, by letting it surprise you. You don't need to polish every thought. But that only happens when you stop trying to perform perfection, and start noticing when reality hands it to you unexpectedly. You don't need to solve every contradiction. You don't need to make sense of every moment. Some of them are perfect because they don't make sense. Some of them carry meaning precisely because they don't belong. A song you heard out of place. A stranger who said the right thing without knowing. A line in a book that hit too hard to be coincidence. That's the part of reality that refuses to be rehearsed. That's not noise. That's the unscripted symmetry of the world. How do I make this perfect? And start asking. So maybe stop asking. What if the mistake is the perfection? Maybe it's since not supposed to be fixed. Because maybe reality isn't set broken. Maybe it was never finished in the first place. Maybe it sits still happening, still unfolding. Is notice the places where something went wrong. And all you have to do, still forming meaning in the spaces you least expect, and turned out beautifully anyway. There's a strange truth about the human mind, one it rarely admits. You don't believe what's accurate. You believe what feels true, and what feels true is often what's familiar, what's repeated, what's simple enough to hold and soft enough to soothe. Accuracy is technical. Believability is emotional. And in the quiet mechanics of your everyday life, believability wins almost every time. You've probably noticed it. Two stories exist, one full of nuance, contradiction, complexity, and another, smoother version. Easier to digest. The simpler story is the one that spreads. It becomes the version people remember, the one they quote, the one they trust. Not because it's more correct, but because it sounds more correct. This isn't set failure, it's set survival. Your brain is designed to conserve energy, to make decisions quickly, to assign meaning fast. So when a thought appears that seems close enough to true, you hold on to it, you repeat it, you pass it on, not because you've tested it, but because it feels right. And this happens more than you think. You hear a phrase that resonates, so you make it a belief. You see something repeated enough, so you treat it as fact. You feel something deeply, so you use it to justify your view of the world. It sits not always wrong, but it sits rarely verified. Because your brain doesn't ask, is this accurate? It asks, can I live with this? And if the answer is yes, then the search for accuracy stops. Think about history, not the kind in textbooks, but the kind told in families, in cultures, in memory. The version of an event you remember isn't necessarily what happened. It's what was told to you most clearly, most emotionally, or most often. You weren't there, you didn't cross-examine. You accepted the version that stuck. Because it fit. Because it echoed. Because it made you feel something. That sips believability. And it builds your world. Now think about your own identity. Are you the person you actually are? Or the one you believe yourself to be? Do you remember your past accurately? Or just the version of your past that you've rehearsed the most? Do you understand your thoughts? Or do you just narrate them into something that feels coherent? Believability becomes a filter. And over time, you forget you sit even using it. You stop asking, is this true? And start asking, does this make sense? Does this fit the pattern? Does this help me sleep? And the answers guide you, not toward accuracy, but toward emotional closure. You might even choose a belief because it makes you feel better. A comforting worldview, a hopeful philosophy, something that gives you order, even if the data disagrees. That sip's not always wrong, but it is revealing. Because if the truth makes you anxious, you'll avoid it. If the lie makes you feel stable, you'll protect it. And you unset even though you set to doing it. Entire systems, education, religion, politics, science, are shaped by this. The theories that get attention are often the ones that sound right, not the ones that are most correct. The leaders who rise are often those who speak clearly, not necessarily truthfully. The stories that spread are the ones that feel clean, not the ones that reflect reality's mess. And so, believability becomes a performance, a craft, a kind of aesthetic, and reality adjusts itself to match it. But here sits the deeper paradox. Sometimes, believability isn't set, just preferred. It sits necessary, because reality, in its raw form, is too much. Too fragmented, too fast, too contradictory. If you had to verify everything you saw, felt, and thought, you'd never move, you'd never speak, you'd collapse into doubt. So the mind does something clever. It builds a version of the world that feels stable, not because it sits accurate, but because it sits believable enough to navigate, and you live inside that version. So where does this leave you? Should you distrust everything? Should you question every belief? Should you burn it all down in the name of accuracy? Not necessarily, but you should notice the difference between what you believe and what is true, between what is emotionally coherent and what is factually confirmed. Because once you see the gap, you can walk it with awareness. You can say, I believe this, not because it's perfect, but because it helps me live. You can say, this version of truth may not be flawless, but it holds me together. And you can admit, when the time comes, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this belief is just a habit that feels like fact. That sips not weakness. That sips clarity, because believability isn't set the enemy. But when you mistake it for truth, you lose the ability to grow. And if reality is pretending to work, if it sips built on illusions that behave just enough, then you need to be extra careful about the stories that feel too right to question, because those are the ones you never examine. Those are the ones that shape you in silence. Those are the ones that run deepest, not because they're strong, but because they were never challenged. So tonight, let yourself wonder, what do I believe, just because it feels good to believe it? And what might be waiting for me on the other side of that question? There's something comforting about believing the universe is clean, that it's structured, polished, pristine, a masterwork of cosmic architecture. You imagine gravity like invisible strings holding stars in elegant spirals. You picture time like a flowing river, smooth and dependable. You see yourself as a precise arrangement of atoms, coded by logic, built with purpose. But what if that sips not how it really is? What if the cosmos isn't set pristine? What if it's patched, taped, and barely holding together? Not a machine built by design, but a mess that keeps functioning out of habit. What if the universe, in all its vast, unfathomable mystery, is just duct taped together? It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Too human, too messy, too improvised for something so massive. But that's exactly what makes the idea feel more true. Because when you look closely, the seams are everywhere. Physics, for all its elegance, is stitched together from contradictions. Quantum mechanics says particles exist in multiple states at once until observed. Relativity says time bends, slows, and speeds depending on where you're standing. Combine them, and the math starts to scream. One rule works for the very small, another for the very large, and neither agrees with the other. Scientists have tried for decades to unify it. They call it the grand unified theory, the theory of everything. But it hasn't set come, because maybe there isn't set one. Maybe reality isn't set built on one elegant truth. Maybe it's a handful of broken truths, stuck together with cosmic tape. And it sips not just physics. Your own biology is a mess of improvisation. Your spine isn't well designed. Your eyes have a blind spot. Your genes carry instructions from ancestors that no longer exist. Evolution doesn't build from scratch. It reuses, it adapts, it stacks awkward solutions on top of each other until something mostly works. Like an engineer fixing a leak with whatever tools are nearby. And still, it lives. It breathes. It thinks. It believes in beauty. That sips the duct-taped miracle. You see stars arranged in constellations, but that's your projection. You find rhythm in orbits, but that's just momentum that hasn't failed yet. You trust sunrise and gravity and breathing, but you don't know why they started or if they'll always stay. Because deep down, the universe doesn't owe you elegance. It owes you nothing. And still, it pretends to function. Like a play that never rehearsed, but performs anyway. There sits duct tape in your psychology too. Biases that contradict. Emotions that override logic. Dreams that rewrite memory. You remember what you need, not what happened. You believe what soothes, not what sips proven. You function, but not because you sit flawless. You function because you sieve taped enough contradictions together to create something stable enough to believe in. The cosmos may be doing the same. Imagine the Big Bang, the ultimate duct tape moment. A singularity that exploded into everything, with no clear reason why. No purpose. Just pressure and heat and chance. And yet, here you are, asking questions, filling your lungs, whispering into the fabric of the universe, that you sit are aware you exist. That sips not order. That sips adaptation. That sips function in spite of failure. That's the duct-taped cosmos, humming softly in the background. What happens when a star dies? It collapses in on itself, becomes a black hole, tears the rules of time and space into ribbons. And yet, the universe allows it, doesn't correct it, doesn't stop it. It just keeps going, with a hole in its fabric, and a smile made of silence. Would a perfect universe allow such violence? Or is perfection not the point? Maybe it was never meant to be perfect. Maybe it was meant to continue. Because duct tape is a survival tool. And survival, not symmetry, might be the law of everything. There sits beauty in that. In a cosmos that says, I don't have to be flawless. I just have to hold. So what does that mean for you? It means your life doesn't need to be tidy. Your purpose doesn't need to be profound. Your thoughts don't need to line up in straight rows. You can patch together your beliefs. You can hold joy and grief at the same time. You can make peace with not knowing, and still live fully. You are not here because a plan was perfectly executed. You are here because enough mistakes were forgiven. By time, by randomness, by warmth, and the result was you. You're held together by stories you've taped across your cracks. And the world keeps spinning, not because it sips unbroken, but because it hasn't fallen apart yet. And maybe that sips enough. So the next time something doesn't make sense, when the numbers don't add up, when the rule breaks, when the feeling refuses to fit the frame, remember, it's not supposed to make perfect sense. It's supposed to work long enough for you to move forward. And the cosmos, this whole stitched up, humming machine, is doing its best with what it has. Just like you. Not all mistakes reveal themselves as mistakes. Some wear the costume of insight. Some sit so quietly in your thoughts that you mistake them for truth. Some persuade. They persuade you not because they are correct, but because they sound like something that should be correct. Because they fit your expectations. Because they feel like memory. Because they echo what you've already accepted. These are the errors that don't break the illusion. They build it. You sit and counted them in conversation. A confident voice making a false claim, and the room nods, not because it sits true, but because it feels true enough. You've seen them in your mind, a thought that repeats often enough, that repetition becomes evidence. I always ruin things. I sit will never be enough. This is how people are. Statements born not from fact, but from frequency. Errors, repeated, become familiar. And the mind is loyal to the familiar. This is how propaganda works. How prejudice survives. How self-hate takes root. The facts don't need to support it. The experience doesn't need to prove it. The only requirement is that the error makes just enough emotional sense to be allowed to stay. And once it stays, it decorates itself with logic. It gathers support from past moments, carefully selected. It filters incoming data, accepting only what fits. This is called confirmation bias. The tendency to see what we expect, to interpret the world in a way that preserves the error we already believe. But it sits deeper than that. Some errors don't just survive. They persuade others. They offer a shape that minds can rest inside, a simplicity that smooths out contradiction. Consider the stories we love. Heroes and villains, beginnings and endings, reasons for everything. They rarely reflect reality. They reflect desire. Desire for order, for narrative, for a clean arc. But life is jagged, asymmetrical, unresolved. So we stitch meaning into places where meaning doesn't grow. We plant reason where only chaos was. We look back at randomness and say, of course it had to happen this way. This is the hindsight illusion, an error of storytelling, but one that persuades, because without that persuasion, The world feels untethered. So we let the error stay. We protect it. We call it intuition. Even science, the sacred space of objectivity, is not immune. Entire theories have persisted for decades, because they were persuasive, not accurate, because they were elegant, symmetrical, comfortable, until something undeniable broke through, and the theory cracked. But even then, the error didn't die easily. It never does. Because errors that persuade aren't held up by facts. They are held up by trust. And trust is slow to change. You trust what has worked before, even if it was wrong. You trust what is shared by others, even if no one verified it. You trust what feels right in your body, even if the feeling is just a memory in disguise. This is how systems persist. How false narratives become culture. How suffering becomes identity. It starts not that we choose the lie. It sits that the lie becomes easier to carry than the uncertainty of the unknown. So what happens when you begin to notice? When you spot the error and feel its charm? When you realize that a belief you clung to, about yourself or the world, isn't it true, but still feels like home? What do you do with an error that comforts you? Do you tear it out? Replace it with the sterile sharpness of accuracy? Maybe not. Because persuasion isn't it always bad. Sometimes it's what gets you through. A belief that you'll still be okay, even if the odds say otherwise. A faith that you loved, even if you don't always feel it. A story that gives you meaning, even if it's fiction. But there's a difference between using the error as a bridge and mistaking it for the ground beneath you. You can hold persuasion gently, like a myth you love, like a poem that sips not literal, but true in another way. The danger only comes when you refuse to let it be questioned, when you protect it with anger, when you force it onto others, when you let it shape your life, without ever asking if it still fits. So tonight, let yourself ask, what have I believed? Not because it was accurate, but because it persuaded me. What have I trusted? Not because I tested it, but because it felt familiar. And what would happen if I loosened my grip? Not to abandon the story, but to see it more clearly, to let it evolve. Because truth is not always clean, and error is not always ugly. Sometimes the most persuasive mistake carries within it a glimpse of something deeper, a signal, a metaphor, a doorway. And when you see it not as a flaw, but as a starting point, you gain the power to rewire the loop, to unwrite the old script, to replace the false, not with silence, but with something gentler, something earned. Because persuasion without truth is fragile, but persuasion aligned with truth, that sips how worlds change. And maybe, just maybe, that sips how reality keeps itself intact. By persuading you, just long enough, to keep asking. You don't see the code. You never have. And yet, it moves beneath everything. Unspoken, unwritten, unseen. A sequence of silent instructions that hold the world together just long enough to keep you believing it works. Just long enough to make you think it's always worked, that it has to work. But what if the code isn't set perfect? What if it was rushed? What if the program you call reality isn't a polished system running flawlessly in the background, but a patchwork script full of duct-taped logic, broken subroutines, and forgotten updates? And what if, even with all its errors, its contradictions, its strange loops, the code still runs? Consider how your computer behaves. Sometimes the app freezes, the cursor vanishes. You click something, and nothing happens until it suddenly does, all at once. The system lags, but it doesn't crash. Why? Because the code, flawed as it is, still knows how to recover. Because someone built in backup plans. Or maybe because the errors themselves became part of the plan. Now extend that metaphor to everything. The thoughts in your head, the routines in your body, the rotations of the stars, the memory of who you were yesterday. They all feel stable, predictable, connected. But what if they are not? What if they're just the successful outputs of a code that's constantly correcting itself in silence? Maybe the universe doesn't run like a machine. Maybe it limps. But it limps in a straight enough line, that you don't sit notice the sway. Think of evolution. It's not a process that aims for perfection. It just adapts whatever doesn't kill the organism. Survival doesn't require optimization, just enough coherence to not collapse. Maybe reality is the same. Maybe the laws of physics, the constants of nature, the rhythms of time and decay, aren't carved in stone. Maybe they're just defaults, workarounds, legacy code from an origin event no one remembers. And yet, the code still runs. You wake up. You breathe. You remember your name. Gravity holds. Light travels. Consciousness streams through your mind like a script being read without pause. But have you ever wondered, what would happen if the code stopped? What if, for a moment, gravity hesitated? What if the sun rose 1 minute too early? What if the self you believe you are didn't boot up correctly one morning? Would you notice? Or would the code correct itself before you even had time to ask? Maybe that déjà vu was a rollback. Maybe that glitch in time was a recompile. Maybe your sudden clarity in the middle of confusion wasn't it insight, but the code catching up. You think you say autonomous, but you never see the back end. You think you sit choosing, but what if the outcome is preloaded? What if you steer not the user, just another process in the system? Still, the code runs. Even with contradiction. Even with paradox. Even with all the strange things that shouldn't exist. Love. Forgiveness. Imagination. The color blue. There's no practical reason these things had to evolve. And yet, here they are. Not because they were necessary, but because the system didn't crash when they appeared. And that's what makes it beautiful. That in all its disorder, its misfires, its recursive bugs, the universe kept going. Because running is more important than being perfect. Your own thoughts prove this. You contradict yourself daily. You forget your intentions. You dream impossible things and act as if they make sense. And still, you wake. You live. You carry forward. You are proof that the code doesn't need to be flawless. Only persistent. But here's the strange part. You trust the system. You trust that when you speak, your words will make sense. That the next step you take won't send you flying into space. That the story of your life will continue to unfold as if the script was already written. And maybe it is. Or maybe it sets being written in real time. By code that doesn't know how to stop. A loop that continues out of habit. A function that calls itself forever. You may never see the source code, but you see its patterns. And you trust its rhythm. Even when it stutters. Even when it lies. Even when it lets you down. And still, somehow, keeps you standing. So tonight, ask yourself, is it enough that the code still runs? Even if it sits imperfect? Even if it sometimes hurts? Even if it was never meant to be beautiful, but became beautiful by mistake? Because that might be the most honest kind of magic. Not a perfect world, but a persistent one. A world that doesn't end, just because it never made sense. A world that continues, because it continues. And maybe that's the real truth. Not that reality is flawless, but that it's still here, still working, still pretending to function, long enough for you to dream again. The door opens, the sun rises, the coffee brews, the day unfolds, everything works. And so you don't question it. But beneath the smooth surface, something stranger may be happening. What if the world doesn't set function, because it sets real, but because it sits convincing? What if it works not by design, not by truth, but by illusion? Not a deception in the malicious sense, but a presentation, a performance, a projection that mimics structure just long enough to earn your trust. Because the illusion of function is enough to keep you inside the game. You've seen it before, illusions that act like reality. A mirage that looks like water. A dream that feels like waking. A memory so vivid, you forget it never happened. They didn't need to be real to work. They only needed to feel real at the right moment. And maybe that's all reality is doing. Maintaining appearances. Matching expectations. Delivering continuity, even if the mechanism behind it is nonsense. Because illusion has power. A magician doesn't need to break the laws of physics. They only need to appear to. A lie doesn't need evidence. It only needs timing, emotion, and a willing audience. And life, it doesn't need to be founded on truth. It only needs to keep moving. This is the trick. When something works, you stop questioning why it works. And when you stop questioning, the illusion deepens. Your senses become complicit. Your memories assist in the cover-up. Your routines reinforce the script. And before long, the world doesn't seem like it's pretending anymore. It seems natural. But what if natural is just the most believable illusion? Think of how your mind fills in gaps. Your blind spot in vision, patched by the brain, without you noticing. The parts of your story you forget, rewritten without permission. The gaps in logic you ignore, paved over with emotion. It's not accuracy that keeps you sane. It's coherence. It's flow. It's illusion, dressed as understanding. And so, the world may do the same. Not because it is deceiving you, but because deception is part of how things keep moving. You say you know where you are. You say you know who you are. But pause. Look again. Are you sure? Or have you just agreed to believe a version of yourself that hasn't been updated in years? You say you understand how time works, how events unfold in a neat forward line. But memory disagrees. So do dreams. So do those strange moments when the past feels louder than the present, and the present feels like a scene you've seen before. The illusion says, this is normal. This is how things are. And you say, okay, because to question every detail, to unweave the pattern, is too exhausting. And because, deep down, you suspect there might be nothing underneath, just scaffolding, empty frames, a slideshow of convincing simulations. So the illusion continues. Reality plays its part. It mimics consistency. It imitates structure. It hands you cause and effect, but only just enough. It lets you believe in order, but only where you stir looking. It lets you plan, act, and decide, but only within the sandbox you were given. And when you hit the edge of the illusion, when something doesn't make sense, you explain it away. You say it was a dream, or a glitch, or a moment of stress. You patch the break with story. Because if the illusion stops working, everything else does too. You need the floor beneath your feet. Even if it's made of fog, you need the mirror to reflect something. Even if it's not you. So the illusion isn't an enemy. It's a companion. A quiet partner in your effort to live a life that doesn't collapse under the weight of uncertainty. You may never know what's really behind the curtain. A system, a mind, a simulation, a void. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the illusion was never meant to be exposed, only experienced. Maybe its truth lies not in what it is, but in what it allows. It allows you to feel love, to mourn, to imagine, to remember, to tell stories, even if none of it can be verified, even if it's all temporary, even if you're dreaming it all right now. So here sits the question. Would it matter if the illusion was all there was? Would the meaning dissolve or deepen? If the world is a mirage, does that make the thirst less real? If the pattern is artificial, does that erase the beauty? Maybe not. Maybe the illusion working is the only truth that matters. Not because it sits perfect, but because it allows you to be here, right now, inside this moment, listening to these words, drifting between wonder and doubt, because even if it's all just illusion, you steer still here, and the illusion hasn't broken yet. A glitch is supposed to be a mistake, a brief flicker in the matrix, a broken thread in the system. But what if glitches aren't errors? A pause, a repeat, a hesitation, a sign that something isn't working as it should. It isn't collapsing. What if the moment reality stutters? What if they redaptations? It steps learning how to continue. You seen it before. The lights flicker. Your name is said before anyone says it. The same song plays at the same time across different days. You walk into a room and forget why. And then, as if the script skipped a line, everything goes back to normal. But it's not normal. The glitch wasn't erased. It's slightly different. It was absorbed. Reality adapts. Like a river finding a new course after a stone is dropped. like a dream correcting itself when the logic starts to fall apart. The system doesn't stop, like a conversation shifting mid-sentence when someone forgets the words. It adjusts. You tell yourself it was coincidence, a moment of tiredness, a trick of the senses, not to erase the glitch, because that sips what the system wants. But maybe you shouldn't set, but to fold it back into the illusion, so you stop noticing where the performance hesitates. Because glitches are where the system reveals its seams, where the pretending gets exposed for just a second. It's when you see that the world around you isn't running on perfection. It's steps running on flexibility, and that second is precious. On-the-fly decisions made by a reality that wants one thing, on constant patching, to keep going. And it will do whatever it must to achieve that. Even hide what it just showed you. Even rewrite itself mid-thought. The wrong name for someone you've known for years. Think of how your own mind glitches. The word on the tip of your tongue that disappears. The hallucination in the corner of your eye that vanishes before you can look. Your consciousness doesn't panic. It patches. It adapts. It tells a story where the mistake didn't happen. It rationalizes. And that sips how reality survives. Not by never breaking. It moves on. That sips resilience. That sips not failure. But by adapting fast enough that you stop looking at the break. But it makes you wonder, if reality can change itself when it malfunctions, what is it supposed to be? Is there an original version? That it no longer remembers its first shape? Or is the system so used to improvising? Maybe there never was one. On watching itself from inside and making corrections in real time. Maybe reality has always been built on adaptation, like a story that writes itself based on how you're reading it. And maybe you too are part of that system, not just a character in the script. When you expect consistency, reality bends toward it, but part of the writing engine. When you doubt something strongly enough, it rewrites the outcome. When you stir confused, a coincidence, with something comforting, reality adapts to match your confusion. A perfectly timed distraction, a half explanation. Glitches aren't just failures. They stir feedback. And it doesn't want to lose you. Reality is paying attention. It corrects itself just enough to keep you watching. So when it stutters, just enough to keep the illusion stable. But it sits not just reacting. It sits evolving. Mistakes become rituals. Glitches become features. Errors become myths. What once seemed random gets folded into the pattern. Like the wrong note in a song, that becomes the hook. Like the accidental brushstroke that defines the painting. Reality isn't perfect. It sits adaptive. And its most powerful skill is convincing you it never broke. You did see the glitch. But here sips your secret. You remember it. Faintly. Behind your rationalizations. Beneath the story you told yourself to explain it. You saw the slip, the error, the unscripted moment. And now, you can unsee it. So what do? You don't need to fear it. You don't need to fix it. You only need to witness it. Reality, not pretending. Because in that witnessing, you glimpse something rare. That pausing, adjusting, breathing. And maybe that sips the real truth. Not that the world is broken. Not that it sits perfect. But that it sits alive in a strange, non-human way. Self-correcting. Impressionable. In conversation with your consciousness. And the glitches? They spur not signs of failure. They sipped the system's way of saying, so let it. I saw that. Let me try again. Let the illusion adapt. Let the story stutter and smooth itself over. Let the crack form and reseal. Maybe it sips about whether it sips responsive. Because maybe it's not about whether reality is real. And if it is, then maybe the most important thing you can do is stay awake enough to notice when the world blinks and decides to keep you believing. Used to have been taught to fear the misfire. The moment something doesn't go as planned. The sentence that doesn't land. The emotion that arrives uninvited. The connection that misses by inches. We label them as errors, failures, glitches, signs that something is off. But what if they sit or not? What if misfires are not only normal, but necessary. And more than that, what if they sip are comforting? Because the truth is, you're surrounded by misfires. Every day, every hour, and somehow, everything still works. The light bulb flickers, but doesn't go out. Your heart skips a beat, but keeps beating. You forget what you were saying mid-sentence, but the conversation flows on anyway. Tiny lapses, constant interruptions, but the system continues. You continue. That sip's not fragility. That sip's resilience in disguise. The idea that things must go right to be meaningful is a lie. It's just a fantasy of control. But the real world, the one you live inside, is built on the grace of things going wrong, and still working. A misfire isn't set the opposite of function. Sometimes it sits how function evolves. Look at your brain. Neurons misfire all the time. Signals travel the wrong paths. But sometimes, that wrong path forms a new connection. A shortcut. A metaphor. An idea that didn't exist before. Creativity is often a misfire. So is love. You love people not because they said are perfect. Not because every word is well timed. But because of the softness in the mistake. The way they fumble and recover. The way they pause and try again. Misfires make people real. And maybe, they make the universe real too. Imagine if everything were flawless. Every sound exact. Every moment fully planned. Every emotion rational. Wouldn't that feel lifeless? It sets the pause that gives music its power. It stops the silence that gives language its rhythm. It's the hesitation that makes a gesture feel honest. Perfection doesn't move you. Vulnerability does. And misfires are tiny moments of vulnerability. From systems that usually hide behind polish. They spurt cracks in the script. Interruptions in the loop. And yet, they invite something deeper. They invite you to be present. To ask, why did that happen? What does it mean that it didn't go as planned? What else could unfold now that the expected path is gone? Because that sips the hidden gift of misfires. They open doors you didn't know were there. A misheard word leads to a different conversation. A missed bus leads to a chance encounter. A forgotten memory returns in a dream. And everything changes. Misfires surprise you into meaning. They bypass the filter of expectation and speak directly to the part of you that still believes. The world is alive. Still shifting. Still improvising. Still paying attention to you. And isn't that comforting? That the system is not rigid. That reality is not a cold machine. That it can make room for mistakes. And even grow stronger because of them. The Japanese concept of wabi-sabi holds that beauty is found in imperfection. In the asymmetry. In the chipped bowl. In the faded ink. In the things that show time. And survive it. Misfires carry that same beauty. Not in spite of their unpredictability. But because of it. They remind you that you are not a machine either. You forget things. You say the wrong word. You feel the wrong feeling at the wrong time. But somehow, your life continues. And sometimes it continues more truthfully because of those moments. The apology you didn't mean to say. The emotion you couldn't hold back. The truth that slipped out before you had time to dress it up. These are the places where your soul shows. Where the mask cracks just enough. To remind everyone, you scepter here. You are real. And reality responds. So what does this mean for the larger system? Maybe it means reality doesn't just allow misfires. Maybe it needs them. To adapt. To shift. To find better versions of itself. Just like you. Because if everything went right all the time, there would be no room for transformation. The misfire is the moment of maybe. And in that maybe, a new thread begins. So don't be afraid when something skips. When the thought stutters. When the dream changes direction. When the light flickers, but doesn't go out. That sips reality adjusting its weight. Making space for something you didn't plan for. But maybe needed. So rest in the comfort of misfires. Know that they are part of the design. Or perhaps the design never mattered. Only the recovery. Only the resilience. Only the fact that despite the error, the story goes on. And maybe, just maybe, it sups those small, strange interruptions that keep you from sleepwalking through the illusion. Because when something breaks the loop, You finally notice the loop. And you ask, was it always like this? Have I been here before? What else have I missed while pretending things made sense? That question is the gift. And the misfire is the messenger. You've been taught to trust what repeats, to believe in the pattern, to find meaning in the steady rhythm of things, that it must be real. If something keeps happening the same way, you assume it must be true, that it must matter. But what if consistency is just choreography? What if it sits not truth, just timing, just habit, just momentum? A loop can be consistent. So can a system designed to mimic stability without ever being stable. So can a lie. That sips the trap. You begin to confuse what is reliable with what is real, because your mind loves rhythm. It builds trust, not from evidence, but from familiarity. It finds peace in recurrence. The sunrise, the ticking of the clock, the way people ask how are you and expect you to say fine. These aren't sit truths. Their performances repeated until belief replaces curiosity. So ask yourself, is consistency proof, or just camouflage? You've seen this before. A belief that SIP's never been questioned. A memory that rewrites itself over and over. A behavior you repeat without knowing why. Each version feeling more true than the last, simply because it survived. That's SIP's consistency. But it isn't set truth. Its steps just a loop that no one has interrupted. In psychology we call it conditioning. In science we call it replication. In life we call it routine. Repetition gives the illusion of reliability. But in all cases, if a machine outputs the same number every time, you call it trustworthy. Even if the number is wrong, you trust the echo, even if the original assumption was false, even if the code behind it is broken, not the source. And this happens in your thoughts too. You believe something not because it was proven. It no longer feels optional, but because you thought it so many times, that you stir not lovable, that the world is unsafe. These are not facts. That meaning is something you have to earn. They are familiar noises, echoes bouncing through your inner world, so often, so loudly, that silence now feels like a threat. It gives you structures that don't need to be true, and the world around you participates. A calendar that turns, only consistent. A school bell that rings. A job that pays you every Friday. These create the rhythm, but not the why. Just the feeling of order, not the truth. Of continuity, of something that once fall apart, even if it was never whole to begin with. And in that continuity, you stop asking questions. Because when something feels consistent, you assume it no longer needs to be examined. That SIP's how belief systems endure. That SIP's how people stay in the same emotional loops for years, without noticing the walls are cardboard. That SIP's how trauma gets mistaken for identity, because the illusion of consistency is more soothing than the chaos of truth. Truth shifts. Truth interrupts. Truth breaks patterns. Truth hurts. But consistency lulls. It gives you something to hold, even if it's empty. Even if it sets the same repeated phrase, even if it sits lying, over and over, with no one left to hear it. You can live inside that rhythm. You can build a life there, and forget that you haven't changed in years. You can smile in the mirror, the hollowness, because the loop has stayed intact, but deep down you feel it. So what happens when you step outside the rhythm? The sense that you playing your part too well. The quiet ache of something rehearsed. When you pause the pattern. When you say, this has always been this way. But should it be? Maybe the loop glitches. Maybe something inside you stutters and shows its seams. Maybe the world tilts slightly, because the system wasn't designed to be true. It was designed to continue. It wasn't built for truth, but for survival. So the system hides it, wraps it in rituals, and sometimes truth interrupts survival, masks it with repetition, softens it with predictability, and you forget to ask what any of it means. So tonight, ask, what has remained consistent in your life? What part of your identity, not because it sits right, but because you never challenged it, feels most real, only because it's always been there? And what might you discover? Because maybe the truth isn't sit consistent. If you paused the loop long enough to hear what sits behind it, maybe it sits chaotic, disruptive, alive. Maybe it doesn't still repeat. Maybe it sings once and waits for you to remember it. Are the ones that never had to lie out loud because they simply rehearsed themselves into comfort. And maybe the most dangerous lies, a drum beat. But now you know. Now you see the rhythm for what it is. A loop, not a compass, not a direction. So listen carefully. And when the beat repeats, ask it if it sits still telling the truth, or just playing the same note. So you once did notice the silence underneath. They demand your attention. They break things. Some lies are loud. They echo in headlines and arguments and regrets. But some lies are quiet. So quiet, in fact, that they begin to function. They don't sit, scream. They hum. They blend into the background. They find a place in the system. And then they operate. They work. They move the machine forward. These are the lies that Dunn said just exist. They sustain relationships. They keep people employed. They make you get out of bed in the morning. Not because they sit true, but because they sit true useful. And so, you let them stay. Maybe it started with a small thing. I still okay. It sips not a big deal. This is what I sipped have always wanted. And then the system adapts around it. People start responding to that version of you. You build routines around that version. You plan futures from the logic of that lie. And now, so the lie becomes operational. To tell the truth would mean undoing everything. It fuels the schedule. It sustains the smile. It lives in your resume. It nods through meetings and handshakes. It tucks itself into your voice. And strangely, things begin to work. Not because they sip are built on truth, but because they sit are built on agreement. Agreement that we once sit mention the glitch. That we still keep showing up. That we still keep pretending the engine is fine, even if it sits leaking something ancient and vital. And the world rewards that. Because systems don't care if they sit are built on truth. Only if they sit stable. So can a country. Only if they keep moving. A company can run on lies. So can a soul. Because a lie, if maintained carefully, so can a family. To can produce results. You can make money. You can make meaning. You can make it to next year. But the cost? The cost is silence. You stop saying what you really mean. You stop remembering what life felt like before the lie became policy. You stop noticing how far you drifted. Because you spent so long surviving with it. You no longer know how to breathe without it. And still, it operates. The lie that you hit so certain. The lie that you sit are happy. You don't just even believe it anymore. The lie that you sit supposed to be here. But you repeat it. Because if the lie fails, you rehearse it. You protect it. And the structure is beautiful, isn't set it. The whole structure might fall. It has memories in it. Dreams. People you love. Things you built. Identities that took years to carve. To tear it down now. To say this was never real. Feels like betrayal. So the lie lives. It operates. Quietly. And the strange thing is, efficiently. Sometimes it does good things. Sometimes it helps people. Sometimes it gets you through the day. Sometimes it shields you until you're strong enough to face something truer. So maybe the lie isn't evil. Maybe it sips medicine. But only for a while. Because there comes a moment when the lie starts to choke. It dims your voice. It no longer protects. It confines. It turns your dreams into checkboxes. What silence feels like. You start to forget what joy feels like. What the absence of pretending feels like. It sits still operating. And that sips when you know. But it sips not yours anymore. You stir just a passenger. It belongs to the system now. You can sit just shut the lie down. And here sips the paradox. You can't rip it out and expect life to continue seamlessly. You have to migrate from it. Because it sips woven into the infrastructure. Carefully. Consciously. Breath by breath. You have to build a new truth. Strong enough to take its place. Not by force. But by remembering. Remembering who you were. Before you started optimizing for acceptance. before you adjusted your settings to match what others needed, before you lost track of your original software. Because underneath the operating lie, there sits, still a pulse, a memory of truth, not the kind you prove, but the kind you feel, doesn't need validation, the kind that doesn't need applause, doesn't even need to make sense. It only needs space. And once you give it space, the lie starts to slow, its gears loosen. Because it was only ever running, its urgency fades, to keep you safe in a world that didn't feel safe enough for your full self. But maybe now it is. Or maybe now you are. What part of my life still operates on a truth I no longer believe? So tonight, ask yourself, what system have I upheld? Not because it sits honest, but because it sits functional. And what would happen? Not to destroy the structure, if I told the truth, but to build something softer beneath it. Isn't set just a glitch in your life? Because the lie that operates, it is your life. Until you choose something else. And you can. Slowly. Quietly. Without drama. Not because the lie collapsed. One truth at a time. Until the system changes its shape. But because it sits no longer needed. There's a strange kind of survival that doesn't require healing. A pattern that continues, not because it sips whole, but because it sips familiar, but because it repeats. You see it in people. Not because it works. In systems. In yourself. Things that are broken, but still move. Not forward, exactly. Not toward anything clear. Because that sips what they sip's always done. Just onward. The system breaks. But the pieces remember where they used to be. So they fall back into place. Wrongly. To trick you into thinking it's still alive. But with just enough rhythm. Crookedly. That sips what a loop is. A circle pretending to be a path. An old tape replaying its static. A ritual that lost its meaning. And we follow these loops. But not its timing. Even if it hurts in the same spot every time. Even if the content is pain. Because repetition feels like safety. Even if the outcome is always just shy of resolution. Because at least it's predictable. And the mind would rather live inside something predictable and broken than confront the chaos of something new and uncertain. The argument that keeps happening. You've seen this in your own life. The hope that keeps rising, then falling. The goal that keeps almost arriving, then vanishing. It sips not failure. The loop doesn't break. Because breaking it would mean facing the silence underneath. It sips familiarity in disguise. And silence can be terrifying. So you keep spinning. The emptiness where the pattern used to be. And so does reality. Because the world doesn't need to be fixed. To convince you it's working. In roughly the same costume. That sips the trick of the broken system. It just needs to keep showing up. It doesn't fall to pieces. It just repeats. It doesn't announce itself. A little more distorted each time. A little more absurd. A little more hollow. But the rhythm stays. And rhythm feels like purpose. So you stop asking. You stop listening. That sips just how it is. You say things like, and the moment you say that, what sips the point of trying to change it? It's always been like this. The loop tightens. The brokenness buries itself deeper. The pattern becomes self-aware, that knows it sits broken. And now you are living in a system, but counts on the fact that you still stay anyway. Don't look too closely. It whispers, just follow the steps. Don't ask too much. And for a while, that sips easier. Because breaking a loop requires disruption. And disruption means discomfort. It means silence. Change without guarantee. Uncertainty. But what if the loop never breaks? What if it keeps you circling until the end? What if you spend your entire life almost arriving, almost understanding, but never stepping out? Almost healing, or a performance of one. Would you call that a life? Because many people die inside loops they never noticed, while appearing stable on the outside. And many systems decay from within, because decay can repeat too. If it sits orderly enough, you once call it broken. You'll call it tradition. And so, the brokenness hides. In plain sight. In your schedule. In your identity. just recycle. In your thoughts that never evolve, that sits how reality can be broken. It gives you the comfort of rhythm, and still persuade you it sips fine, but you don't have to stay in the circle. Instead of the truth of movement, you can pause. You can notice, keeps happening the same way, that this thing, whatever it is, and it doesn't serve you anymore, and maybe never did. You can ask, what if I let the silence arrive, and didn't fill it with another version of the same? What if I didn't chase the outcome I always chase? What if I didn't react the same this time? Because the moment you interrupt the pattern, the loop begins to loosen, even slightly. Because, outside the loop, and what feels like fear at first, might actually be freedom. Everything is unfamiliar, but unfamiliar isn't bad. It's just unlearned, unlived, untried, and that sips where new things can finally grow. But the loop will fight back. It always does. It will tempt you with the comfort of the old pain, the neatness of the same mistake, the promise that if you just try it again, this time, it will end differently. But you know better now. You know that some things are broken, not because they cracked once, but because they never evolved, without collapsing. They just found a way to repeat. So tonight, ask yourself, what am I still doing? Not because it works, but because it sits what I always done. What patterns in my life are consistent, but not honest? What part of me is stuck in something broken that has learned how to repeat convincingly? And what might happen if I stepped outside the loop, not to fix it, and movement isn't always progress? Because repetition isn't always safety, but to finally let it end. And the rhythm is just what remains. Sometimes the system is broken, after the meaning is gone. And maybe, but now you've heard the echo, just maybe, you don't want to dance in circles anymore. Cause and effect. The chain that makes the world feel predictable. Do this. Get that. Touch fire. Feel pain. Say the right words. Get love. Work hard. Earn success. It steps comforting, isn't it? The idea that life follows a script. That for every effect, there was a cause. That for every result, there was a reason. That you steer not just spinning in a fog of randomness, but moving through a sequence of logic. But what if that sip's not entirely true? What if cause and effect is a story we tell to explain a world that rarely makes sense? What if the effect came first, and we just backfilled the cause? It happens more often than we like to admit. You get lucky, and then claim it was hard work. You get hurt, and then look for someone to blame. You fall in love, and then invent reasons why it made sense. The truth is, humans are better at storytelling than they are at sequencing. We see patterns. We draw lines. We create connections, because not connecting things feels terrifying. So, we fabricate meaning. Not to lie, but to survive. To feel control where there is none. To build structure around the chaos. Because this happened because is easier to carry than this happened. And I don't know why. And slowly the world starts to wear a mask of logic. But behind it, coincidence. Unseen forces. Biases. Luck. Faulty memory. Desperate hope. Cognitive illusion. And yet, we still write the script. You say, I got this job because I worked hard. But others worked hard too. And they didn't get it. You say, they love me because I'm kind. But there are kinder people who never got a chance. You say, I unhappy because of this one thing. But maybe the thing is a symbol, not a cause. The link between cause and effect. Isn't it always a chain? Sometimes it sits a tangle. Sometimes it sips smoke that looks like a trail. But when you follow it, you realize you stir circling something you never understood to begin with. And reality allows this. Because it doesn't demand accuracy, just persistence. The machine keeps running. Even if the input doesn't actually produce the output. Even if the logic is broken. Even if the connection is imagined. Because the illusion of cause and effect is often enough to sustain the performance. You believe the diet worked. You believe the prayer was answered. You believe the punishment taught the lesson. And so, You do it again, and again, and again, reinforcing a logic that might be built on coincidence. But if it feels real, if it works often enough, you stop questioning. That SIP's how superstitions are born, and also how systems survive. Systems that reward not effort, but compliance. That reward not merit, but access, familiarity, timing. And yet, you tell yourself, I know how this works. But what if you don't it? What if cause and effect is a map drawn after the journey? A map that looks official, but only because you need one to feel safe. Would you still follow it? Would you still trust it? Or would you begin to notice how many of your beliefs were built backward? You felt afraid, so you invented a reason. You felt joy, so you gave it a source. You felt broken, so you chose a villain. The feeling came first. The story came second. And when enough people agree on that story, we call it truth. We build laws around it, build relationships around it, build our sense of identity on it. But all it takes is one moment, one quiet realization, to see the illusion, to see that maybe you stir not where you are because of one choice, but because of 1,000 unseen variables that had nothing to do with fairness or logic. Maybe you were lucky. Maybe you were late. Maybe the door opened not because you knocked, but because someone else forgot to close it. And maybe that SIP's okay, because cause and effect don't need to be perfect for life to move. But knowing the difference, knowing when the connection is real, and when it SIP's imagined, can change everything. It can make you kinder, less arrogant, less quick to judge. It can help you forgive yourself for the things that didn't work, and stop blaming yourself for the things that were never truly in your control. Because if cause and effect was just a script you were handed, then maybe it's time to write your own. Maybe it's time to stop chasing the causes you were told would lead to happiness, and start listening to the effects you actually feel. Joy, calm, clarity, peace, not as rewards, but as signals. Signals that you sit are not chasing illusions, that you set not inventing logic to justify someone else's version of success, but finding your own rhythm, not a sequence, not a chain, but a quiet unfolding that maybe doesn't need a reason, and maybe, just maybe, that SIP's the most honest life of all. The world, it looks peaceful, doesn't it? As you sit in your room, or lie in your bed, watching the ceiling, feeling the breath rise and fall in your chest. Stillness, where everything appears settled, a moment where nothing seems to move. But here SIP's the strange truth, that stillness is made entirely out of motion. It only feels calm, because 1,000 hidden things are vibrating just right beneath the surface. Your body appears still, but blood rushes in rivers under your skin. Your heart pumps. Your lungs expand and collapse like tides. Your neurons fire. Even your mind, thoughts flicker, quiet as it might seem, is never not moving. You don't notice it. Memories shuffle in the background, because it SIP's constant, feels like quiet. But it SIP's not. And constancy. It SIP's the kind of quiet that only exists because a machine is working perfectly. No clicks, no clanks, just a smooth rhythm of motion. That it starts to feel like stillness. So synchronized. When something skips, like peace. But what happens when that motion falters, stutters, trips? Suddenly, you hear the machine. Suddenly you notice the hum behind the silence. Suddenly, stillness becomes noise. And you wonder how you never heard it before. It hides its motion in precision. This is how reality operates. It masks its chaos in routine. Yet your cup of tea doesn't shake. The tectonic plates beneath your feet shift every moment. The earth spins at over 1,000 miles per hour. Yet your floor stays flat. The solar system hurtles through space. And you sit there, calm forged in relentless motion, as if nothing SIP's happening. Stillness built on terrifying speed. Oscillation. Because motion doesn't always look like movement. It can be balance. Systems locked into cycles. So complete. Friction perfectly matched. that they cancel themselves out. It feels like peace. And when the forces oppose each other just right, but what a delicate illusion that is. Moments where you seem calm, you've seen it in yourself too, but only because you're suppressing 10 kinds of chaos. Where the smile holds steady, because the inner storm has nowhere else to go, to memorize the mask. Where your voice doesn't shake, but only because your mind is racing hard enough. Thoughts spinning. You learn to keep still by moving constantly. Inside. To maintain the facade. Rationalizations clicking into place. Nervous systems overclocking. It's exhausting. Kind of. But it works. If the exterior doesn't break. Because no one sees the motion. And so we build our lives like that. Stillness on the outside. Motion beneath. Societies do it too. Like economies, governments, traditions. But they are only stable. We call things stable. Because millions of moving parts are crashing into each other in precisely the right way to simulate permanence. Like 1,000 dancers spinning on a stage, never touching, never stopping. But knock one dancer off course, and the illusion falls apart, making the still image of a statue. So why do we do it? Why build stillness out of motion? Because we crave peace. We want to feel anchored. But we are afraid to stop. But we don't just silence, to give ourselves the illusion. So we move, in just the right patterns, that we are still. We meditate to silence the mind, but we breathing, counting, focusing. Stillness through motion. We build routines to find peace, but the routines are full of tasks, steps, obligations. Stillness through repetition. But we think through our to-do lists. We seek rest as we try to fall asleep. Stillness through mental inertia. And it works until it doesn't. Until the cycle that kept you safe starts to wear you down. Until the motion beneath grows too loud to ignore. And one day is not the same as being at peace. Because, pretending to be still, not from what you set to doing, but from what you holding in, you may find yourself tired. You still feel the weight of keeping everything moving, so that you appear, and in that moment, you might ask, to have stopped. Not a peace constructed from constant effort. What would real stillness feel like? Not a silence built on spinning thoughts. Could you sit in it? But actual quiet. Would you even recognize it? Without fidgeting? Without constructing meaning from the lack? Without planning the next motion? Because real stillness, it doesn't mask chaos. Doesn't perform. It just is. No rhythm. It doesn't spin to keep you balanced. Just presence. And it can feel like falling. No hum. To stay upright in the world. Like losing the only trick you knew. But sometimes, to find out what it actually is, you need to stop performing stillness. To notice the difference between balance and burnout. Between calm and compression. Between peace and pause. And once you feel that, to stop spinning, you can begin to loosen the machine. Not as failure. To sit with motionlessness. Just to stay in place. You'll hear things you missed. Feel things you buried. That is freedom. Let go of motions that never served you. And finally, you'll know. Is still motion. Stillness built on motion. And you don't have to keep turning. To feel alive. But your mind doesn't see the world in full. You probably never noticed it. It sees pieces. Fragments. Glitches. And then, it fills in the rest. Is often just a patchwork of guesses. What you call understanding. Educated ones, maybe. But guesses all the same. There are gaps. In what you see, what you remember. Everywhere. You make sense of it. What you think you know. And yet, you have to. So it paints over it. The brain is terrified of blank space. Quickly, quietly, convincingly, you don't even realize it's happening, and swear it was someone you know. You look at a blurry face in the crowd. You read a sentence with missing letters, and your mind fills in the blanks. Without permission. You fill it in. And when a story doesn't add up, you need to, because uncertainty feels like drowning. We imagine cause where there is coincidence. So we build bridges over gaps. so we don't feel like we are waking up. We fabricate continuity. We assign motive where there was none. But here's the paradox. In a new world each day, those gaps are not flaws. They serve features, those terrifying absences. You sit be overwhelmed. The world is too vast, because without them, too chaotic, too unfiltered, to take in all at once. So your brain deletes most of it, silently, elegantly, and leaves you only what it thinks matters. A filtered hallucination. Not the world. But then something strange happens. But your version of it. You forget the filtering. You forget the gaps. You forget the guessing. And you believe the sense you have made is the truth. You trust it. You act on it. You fight for it. Even when it was never whole to begin with. Even when it was a story. You have seen this in memory. Built on absence. How the gaps in your past get smoothed over. By meaning, by narrative, by need. You don't remember your childhood as it was, who needed to survive it. You remember it as a highlight reel, stitched together by a version of you. You remember what it taught you, what it turned you into. You don't remember the pain as raw, what it allowed you to justify. Sense made from gaps, not to deceive, but to endure. And this is how people survive. They take the fragmented, the broken, the incomplete, and build coherence. You tell yourself why they left, why that moment mattered, why you failed. Because I understand, even if you don't really know, even if no one ever will, feels safer. And yet, something is lost in that smoothing, that I may never know. A texture, a discomfort that may be a truth, because sometimes was supposed to be felt, not explained away. The gap is the message. The thing unsaid in the apology. The silence in the conversation. The missing line in the script. But you rush to fill it. To fix it. To conclude it. And in doing so, you miss what it was really trying to show you. That not all things complete themselves. Not all stories close. Not all patterns are patterns. Some things are gaps. And will remain so. And maybe the real peace comes not from making sense of them, but from sitting with them, from watching the jagged edge of a memory, and not needing to fill it with words, without needing to round it off, from hearing the pause in someone's voice, from seeing the missing piece in yourself, and not rushing to glue something in its place. Because wholeness is not the absence of gaps, the tenderness of knowing, it strips the awareness of them, but of what is instead. You are made not only of what is there, that your life is shaped as much by what never happened, by the rooms you never entered, as by what did, by the words you never spoke, by the futures you never chose. And that sips not failure, that sips form. A sculpture is defined by what sips carved away. Music is built on the space between the notes. Meaning emerges, not just from what sips included, but from what sips left out. And so too do you. You are not broken, because you have gaps. You are human, because you make something beautiful out of them. Even if the beauty is just the attempt to understand. Even if the understanding, even if tomorrow, you'll make a different sense of the same thing, is never fully real. Because sense-making is not a final act. Its dip's a constant one. The brain forever stitching meaning into the torn edges of perception. The mind forever editing reality. And maybe that sip's okay. Maybe we are not meant to fit the story it needs to tell, to see everything clearly. Maybe the gaps are there to remind us that sense doesn't require certainty, but clarity is not the goal. That peace doesn't require perfection and gentleness, and the willingness to accept just presence. That what sip's missing than what sep's been found might always matter more. There are lies you know are lies. The obvious ones. The ones you catch. The deep ones. The ones you can laugh at later. And then there are the other kind. Speaking in the voice of your own thoughts. The ones that hide inside your beliefs. Wearing the clothes of common sense. Delusions. Not because you stir gullible. Not because you said foolish. But because sometimes So your mind wraps it in stories. Reality is too sharp to hold bare-handed, and over time, those stories feel safer than the truth. They become furniture in your inner world, sat on, leaned against, never questioned, not because they sit are invisible, and the mind loves what sips familiar, but because they sit become familiar. It craves coherence. It wants the world to line up, even if it has to bend the facts to make it work. This is where delusions thrive, just slightly. Like the belief that people always mean well. They don't have to be dramatic. They can be subtle, almost kind. That everything happens for a reason. That you are exactly where you're supposed to be. Sometimes those beliefs bring peace. Sometimes they bring paralysis. It starts to organize your reality. Because when a delusion endures long enough, you stop questioning the outcomes, because the story explains it. You stop noticing the cracks, because the narrative seals them. But there sips a cost. Each time you ignore the contradiction, you trade a piece of clarity. Each time you quiet the dissonance, for the comfort of a lie that fits. Until it doesn't set. And it works. Until the story fails you. Until the thing you believed becomes the thing that breaks you. Like when you sip convinced yourself, and so every kindness feels suspicious. That you appear unlovable. Or when you sip decided, you must always be the strong one, and your collapse feels like betrayal. These are not just ideas. They stir scaffolding. They hold up the parts of you that are too scared to fall. You keep them. And so, even when they hurt you, even when you outgrow them, you defend them. Because if the delusion goes, what else does? What part of your identity was built entirely on an illusion you no longer believe, but can sit yet release? The mind doesn't let go easily. It clings to what gave it shape. And sometimes, your whole sense of self is braided into a story that was never true. This is the quiet cruelty of delusions, but was always necessary. A child convinces themselves, they often begin as survival, that their parent sips anger is their fault. They were never protected. Because it's safer than believing. A lonely person convinces themselves that they prefer solitude. Because it sips easier than hoping again. A mind decides. Because the alternative, that everything is under control, feels like falling forever. So these delusions endure. Not out of ignorance, but out of mercy. And yet, eventually, they turn on you. What once explained, what once protected, now imprisons, now obscures, and you begin to feel it. That dull ache beneath the surface. That subtle tension between what you know and what you still pretend. You stir not quite at peace, just stuck, not quite in pain, that almost works. Trapped in a version of reality, almost fits, almost makes sense, but almost is no longer enough. And so, the unraveling begins. Not all at once, not loudly, but in small brave moments, when you say, what if that sip's not true? What if I don't say to fix everything? What if I am worthy of rest? What if the failure wasn't set mine to carry? These questions don't sit to erase the delusion. They make room, but they loosen its grip. Not another neatly packaged belief. Not another lie. For something softer to take root. With what sips unfinished, a willingness to sit, but a quiet curiosity. Unproven, and slowly, uncomfortable. But on honesty, you begin to build a new kind of truth. One that isn't set based on certainty. Not the kind of honesty that demands brutal exposure, but the kind that whispers, you don't have to keep pretending. Gently, you start noticing, you no longer recognize. When you say things you don't believe, when you perform versions of yourself, you feel the weight of maintaining the illusion, and you begin to crave. Because confusion, the freedom of simply being confused, so means something seems waking up, and instead of forcing the shape to match, it means the story no longer fits the shape of your experience. You let the old story crumble, even if it leaves you standing in a room with no walls, no explanations. Because in that open space, no ceiling, a truth not built on delusion, but on presence, something real can begin. A reality not held together by lies, but by your willingness to live without the armor. Not becoming more certain, but becoming more honest. And maybe that's what growing up really is. About the delusions you once needed, about the ones you still carry, and about the brave, quiet work of releasing them. You want it to mean something. Of course you do. That breath you just took. That person you just thought of. That pain you carried longer than you should sip. You want it all to stack up to something real, to something earned. But what if purpose doesn't work that way? To something whole. You're supposed to build on. What if the foundation was never there to begin with? What if there is no bedrock, just shifting sand, and the illusion of ground beneath you? You're told to chase purpose like a destination, as if somewhere, out beyond the mistakes. But then you arrive, waiting to be claimed. There sits a golden center of meaning. At the job, the marriage, the dream. And it still feels hollow, still feels like you're standing on something that could give way at any moment. Purpose isn't set solid, because the truth is, it sits not built into the structure of things. It's something you drape over the chaos, a soft cloth of meaning, thrown over the jagged randomness. And that's not failure, so you can bear to look at it. That sits the miracle of consciousness. You don't live in a world that hands you meaning. You live in a world where you have to make it, where every reason you have for waking up tomorrow is stitched together from choices, memories, guesses, and hope. And yet, the foundation was never there. You were the one laying the bricks. As if it was external. You were told to search for it. As if you had to earn it. So you hunted it down. In relationships. In religion. In recognition. Feel acceptable. In rituals that were supposed to make the absurd. And sometimes, they worked. Until something fell apart. Until they didn't stat. And you realized the thing that gave your life meaning. You saw how quickly it could vanish. Was more fragile than you thought. How easily a belief can dissolve. How fast a role can disappear. And then you were left with the rawness beneath it. The place where meaning once sat, now empty. That might feel like a purpose again. That sips when the panic sets in. When you start clawing for anything. Because the mind hates the void. It doesn't care if the why is true. It wants a why. What if, instead of rushing to fill the gap, it just needs it to hold? But what if you could pause in that moment? Let it echo. You could sit with it. Let it ask you. What if purpose was never a thing to find, but a thing to feel? What if it didn't need a foundation, because it was never meant to be permanent? You don't ask a song what its purpose is. You don't demand it to last forever. You let it move you. You listen. You let it fade. Maybe your purpose is like that. Not a structure, but a moment. A moment when you gave someone your full attention. A moment when you cried without shame. No one else understood. A moment when you created something, but you did. That's not the kind of purpose you can write into a mission statement. It sits quieter than that. It breathes. It breaks. It rebuilds. Has to look like achievement. And it doesn't need to explain itself. The world tells you purpose. Like legacy. But maybe it sits more subtle. Like impact. Maybe it lives in the way you notice the sound of leaves underfoot. Or the way you hold your breath before saying, I love you. Even when you're not sure you'll hear it back. Maybe purpose is what happens when you stop trying to prove your worth and start letting yourself matter anyway. Not because of what you've done, not because of what you still be, but because you exist, and you stir aware of it. That alone is rare. But still, that alone is enough. Something to tell you that your life isn't just improvisation. You ache for foundation. On coincidence. That you stir not floating. You want to know that the people you lost meant something. That you weren't just passing through. That the suffering wasn't wasted. Without touching anything real. And you have. But not in the way you expected. On every conversation you forgot. You left fingerprints. You built bridges. You mattered. out of moments that felt small, to people who will never say it, in the folds of their own becoming. Purpose without foundation, but who carry your presence, is not purposelessness. It accepts permission. Permission to stop waiting for something outside you, to declare you valid. Permission to create, to declare that making tea and watching the light shift on the wall, meaning in the mundane, to stop waiting for the moment, can be holy. When your life will finally begin, you are not broken, that it already has. And realize, quietly, because you can create one, you are free, because you can sit to name your purpose, over and over, without needing it to make sense, without needing it to last, to anyone but you. And if it crumbles tomorrow, you will build again, that already knew how, not from nothing, but from the parts of yourself, because you are not standing on a foundation, you are the foundation. And you have been holding yourself up this whole time. You have pretended more times than you can count, pretended you were okay when everything inside you was unraveling, pretended to be strong, pretended to care when apathy had crept in like a fog, when your chest felt like it would collapse under the weight of your own silence. You smiled in rooms where your name felt like a foreign sound, laughed at jokes, nodded in conversations that never reached your eyes, just to avoid unraveling in front of people who wouldn't know what to do with the real answer. You didn't pretend because you were weak. You pretended because it was safer, because pretending kept things moving, because survival isn't always about truth. Sometimes it sips about illusion. When chosen with care, and illusion can be a kind of mercy. Think about it. The adult tells them it's not real. When a child imagines a monster under the bed, because the comfort matters more than the correction. Why? But still leaves the hallway light on. And maybe that's what you've done for yourself all along. Left the light on. Spoken the soothing fiction. The next day, so you could make it to the next hour. Told yourself stories you needed to hear. The next breath. It was a kind of kindness. It wasn't to lie, only because you allowed it to. There sits a version of you that existed. A version built out of, I'm fine and of course I can. That version may have been exhausted, but it got you here. It walked into the job interview. It showed up for your family when all you wanted was sleep. It held the hand of someone dying. It pushed you through the hours you thought would break you, when you can see the thin film of pretend. And even now, when you sit more awake than ever, layered across your days, you still hesitate to remove it. Because the truth is, what happens when the scaffolding comes down, yet you're not sure what sems underneath? What happens when the mask falls, that never learned how to hide? And all that sips left is the version of you. Will the world be able to hold you? It sips a terrifying kind of honesty, raw and unscripted. Will you be able to hold yourself? To admit that pretending has been your coping mechanism. That illusion is just something society sells. It's something you bought willingly, not because you were fooled, but because you were protecting something tender, and that tenderness deserves reverence. The child who didn't feel safe, beneath the layers, because it's still there. The teenager who laughed too loud to cover the ache, in rooms where their truth was too strange. The adult who learned to shapeshift, too soft, too real. Survival, by pretending, isn't cowardice. It sets adaptation. It sips emotional camouflage. It sips learning how to breathe in atmospheres that were never made for your kind of oxygen. Until now. And it worked. If maybe you don't sin and want to just survive anymore. Until you started wondering. Maybe you want to live. Not exist. Not pass as normal. Not endure. But actually live. Which means unlearning some of the reflexes. Like smiling when you're hurting. Like saying yes when your bones say no. Like staying quiet just because it keeps the peace. Living means risking disappointment. It means letting someone see that you not always the version you present. It means making space, even the parts that make others uncomfortable. But here sips the paradox. For the full, unfiltered spectrum of your being, sometimes, in the beginning, just to imagine what it might feel like to be real, you still have to pretend. You rehearse authenticity. You say, I sit am tired, like lines in a play, instead of, I sit am fine, even if your voice shakes. You say, I need help, even though every muscle in your body clenches at the thought of being vulnerable. When all your life, you were rewarded for certainty. You say, I don't know. And in those small acts, you begin to loosen the grip of performance. You begin to build a life. You begin to feel, really feel, that doesn't require you to disappear in order to function. What it means to be whole. Not perfect. Not polished. Just whole. A person with contradictions. With days of apathy that don't state need to be explained. And moments of fragile brilliance. And bursts of joy. But it doesn't have to take you further. Pretending got you here. You stir aloud to let it go. Bit by bit. Not all at once. Not with dramatic declarations. But in small, holy shifts. Like choosing silence instead of forced conversation. Like pausing before you smile. Like sitting with your sadness. Because survival is no longer the only goal. Without trying to rename it as something more acceptable. Now, you want to feel alive. In the spaces you once endured. You want to speak. To breathe. Without bracing. Without rehearsing. And that begins, without explanation. To exist. With trusting that the real you is enough. Even when you're unsure. Even when you're messy. Even when you're still learning how to be seen. Survival by pretending brought you here. Even if it's clumsy. Even if it sits quiet. But authenticity will carry you forward. You no longer trip over. Not because they disappeared. There are cracks in your life. You step around them without thinking, but because you've memorized them. Trace their outlines like old scars. Accept them like creases in a well-worn page. They're no longer sharp, just familiar. You made peace with certain flaws, not by fixing them, but by adapting to their rhythm. That reflex to apologize first. That late-night overthinking. That way, you downplay your own feelings. They know you. You know them. Because you're afraid they'll take up too much space. And somewhere along the way, those faults started to feel like home. There sits a strange comfort. In the guilt that arrives like clockwork. In the predictable discomfort. In the anxiety you know better than any solution. In the self-doubt that wears the same voice as your own. You think it would make you want to change. You build routines around them. You adjust your relationships. But instead, to avoid triggering them, you decorate the walls of your inner world with compromises you stopped noticing would mean stepping into the unknown. Because to change them, and sometimes the unknown, is more terrifying than the flaw you've come to trust. It sits the paradox of pain. What hurts can still feel safe. If it sits what you always known. So you start to tell yourself stories. That maybe this is just who you are. Or clarity. Or connection. That maybe you not built for consistency. They inform your choices. They shape your expectations. And those stories become part of you. They become the lens through which you interpret your entire life. You stop reaching for something better. But because reaching means letting go. Not because you've given up. Of the story you survived with. Because it feels familiar. But what if the flaw isn't fixed? What if it endures? Not because it sits true, but because it sits comfortable. Sometimes we confuse known with right. We confuse tolerable with harmless. Doesn't mean it benign. But just because you it adapted to the fault, that small self-betrayal, you repeat daily, it accumulates. That hesitation to speak your truth, even in safe rooms, it echoes. That cycle of starting over, it leaves residue in your sense of worth. Just when things begin to feel good. And yet, but because failure too has a pattern, you return to them. Not because you want to fail. And patterns make us feel less alone. But let's pause here. But just to notice. Not to judge. Not to force change. To name the fault. To say, I see you. To touch its surface. Because behind every familiar fault is an origin story. And I know why you stayed here. Where mistakes meant consequences. Maybe your perfectionism was born from a childhood. Maybe your tendency to ghost people when your boundaries were crossed again and again. is the only power you felt you had. Maybe your need to explain yourself. These faults didn't yet arise. Comes from a life of being misunderstood. They were tools. From weakness. Once, they kept you safe. But even that stuckness. Now, they just keep you stuck. Has rhythm. It's easier to dance in a broken loop than to risk falling. And sometimes, in a new direction. Still, every now and then, you say no. You glimpse an alternate way of being, and the world doesn't set collapse. You show emotion, instead of pulling away, and someone leans in, and realize the sky didn't sept fall. And in those moments, you try something new, the fault loosens. But because you stopped feeding it the same story, not because it was conquered, you need to outgrow them. You don't need to wage war on your patterns. With softness, you teach your nervous system. With new evidence, with repetition, that connection doesn't demand a performance. That growth can feel awkward. That safety doesn't require smallness. You stop identifying with the crack, and start seeing yourself as the flaw beneath it. But still be safe, still capable, still holding, still whole. As it will, you greet it like an old friend. And when the old fault resurfaces, you no longer need to entertain. You feel it, you nod. Not because you hate who you were. You make a different choice. And that version of you, but because you're learning who else you could be. The one beyond the patterns. Bizin sup some idealized perfect self. Freer. They sit just more present. They don't flinch. More spacious inside. When someone sees them. They don't shrink. When they feel joy. Because they realized. To feel like they exist. They don't rely on familiar faults. They were real. Existence was never conditional. Before they knew how to survive. Even after the masks fall away. And they still be real. So tonight, just notice. Trace its edges. Notice the fault you have worn like a second skin. Ask yourself what it might feel like. Thank it for what it once gave you. And then, no rush. Just a little. To loosen it. No demand. Just a whisper. You don't have to hold me anymore. And maybe for the first time, you believe it, but it sips more than that. You try to name it, call it habit, cycle, routine. There's a strange rhythm to your life you can't quite trace. It starts not just what you do, it's how you end up back here. Again, and again, and again. As if some part of your experience is stitched with invisible thread. The same kind of person. It's always pulling you back to the same emotional echo. The same kind of silence. You grow. The same kind of ache. You change. You wake up one morning. And still, you learn the language of healing. And realize you are in the same room. The loop persists. Just rearranged. Not because you didn't try hard enough. Not because you stir weak. But because some loops aren't broken by effort. They are broken by awareness. You keep returning to the same thoughts. Because the mind is a pattern recognition machine. It chooses familiarity over freedom. Almost every time. And that not a flaw. But eventually, that's how it keeps you safe. Safety becomes suffocating. The resistance when joy tries to enter. You feel it in your chest. You feel it in your throat. You feel it in your body. A stillness that isn't peace. The pause before truth rises. So you tell yourself, just holding. This time will be different. You map out new habits. You promise not to fall back. You draw lines in the sand that feel permanent. And still, the loop reactivates. And suddenly, somewhere between now and next week, you stir reacting to life as if nothing had changed. That the cruelty of cognitive loops. They don't need new events. They recycle your perception. A single glance can trigger a memory you spent months building. A single sentence can spiral your worth. A single moment can collapse the entire progress. But let's pause here. Not to despair. Not to declare the loop unbeatable. Let's pause. To understand how loops survive. They don't feed on failure. They feed on familiarity. If your nervous system learned that love comes with fear, You still subconsciously search for fear in love. If you grew up equating control with safety, you still struggle to rest in uncertainty. These are not moral failings. They sept neural imprints. And neural imprints don't erase. They rewire slowly, in the opposite direction, through experience repeated. So if the loop says, by trusting one moment, don't trust anyone, you begin, softly. You tell your body, not a person, a breath. And again, this is safe. Again, and again, than the old one. Until that new pattern becomes louder, longer than your ego wants to wait. But it takes time. Because loops love urgency. They want you to react. They survive on speed. Before you notice. So the antidote isn't set effort. Stillness. It's sent slowness. It begins when you say, space between the thought and the choice. Not with shame. I've been here before. With observation. You begin to track the loop. What comes before the storm. Like a scientist studies weather patterns. And slowly, what is the first domino? What signals the spiral? Mid-cycle, you start catching the loop, not before it starts, but before it finishes. And even that is sacred progress. It's just to awaken inside the repetition, to notice the moment. Because the goal isn't to never repeat. You begin walking the same path, and whisper to yourself, I can turn. Not easily, but maybe once. Not always. And twice becomes possibility. Eventually you realize, and once becomes twice. It sips your history, echoing. The loop isn't set your enemy. Still seeking resolution. And if you listen closely, it steps a part of you. The loop isn't saying, stay here. It starts saying, will you notice me this time? Is instead erasing the pattern. Because, healing, it's standing at the fork in the road. It sips offering the pattern, a new ending, and choosing to walk a different way, even if your legs tremble. And if you fall back, the loop is persistent. But so are you. That sip's okay. You've already changed it. Each time you wake up inside it. Because awareness is the first disruption. Creates space. And disruption. You can place something new. A breath. And in that space, a pause. In a moment you always surrendered. A word you've never spoken. Not perfect. You build a new rhythm. And over time, its oldest episodes. But conscious. A life that no longer autoplays. You can listen, but you don't have to dance. You still hear the loop sips music. Smile, because you still remembered something. And sit still. You are the presence. You are not the pattern. The loop always tried to make you forget. And presence doesn't sit loop, watching it unfold. It lives. You go through the motions. Wake up, work, speak, scroll, sleep. Reality has a way of smiling politely while hiding something in its teeth. As if this world was made for logic. But underneath the neat routines and shared beliefs, for clean lines and answers that stay in place. Just pretending. Not broken. Something doesn't sit quite right. Because reality works just well enough. The light turns green, to keep you asking fewer questions. The coffee warms your hands. The device unlocks. And in that ease, you forget that you're sitting on a rock, around a ball of fire, spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. That sips the trick, isn't it? In a galaxy that sips mostly silence. And somehow, you stay worried about your inbox. But that it sips a distraction. Not that the world is a lie. A perfectly timed illusion. That responds just enough to make you feel like you're in control. But when you pause, and let silence settle without rushing to fill it, you notice the cracks. Really pause. The way time moves differently when you're in pain. The way your thoughts echo with voices that aren't yours. The way your memories shift like dreams, retelling themselves for comfort. The deeper you look, not accuracy, the more reality begins to behave like a mask. Language covers the wordless. Stitched together by necessity. Thought covers the raw. And you wear it all. Identity covers the vast. As if this was always you. Smiling. But who would you be? Without the mirror. Without the pressure to make meaning out of noise. Without the name, The truth is, you've never seen reality. You've only seen your version of it. And that version has filters. Cultural ones. Cognitive ones. Emotional ones. Each moment arrives, and your mind rushes to label it. It feels reliable, before it can simply be. That sits the strange comfort of a working illusion, until love rearranges your sense of space. Until it doesn't stet. Until grief cracks open time, doesn't stay need narrative. Until stillness teaches you that presence. And when those cracks appear, you realize the floor beneath you. You wake up. You don't fall through them. That every thought is made of stories, not stone, was once imagined. Every role, every rule, at the end of a script, by someone who mistook certainty for truth. So now you stir here, a mirror that asked, that wasn't set really a script at all, just a mirror. What if it sits not broken? What if it only pretended to work? What if it was never meant to make perfect sense? Because beneath the pretending, so you'd have something to do, while waiting to remember yourself, you remain, beneath even the thoughts that try to catch themselves, beneath the language and the logic, alive, unresolved, untranslated, not as a system, but as a question, not as a self, that cannot be thought from the outside, a thought that refuses to close, perhaps to sleep, perhaps to that liminal space between ideas. So as you drift now, the world doesn't need to make sense, for you to belong in it. Fine, know this. Let the clock tick, to rest in its rhythm. You don't have to decode the dream, and let yourself be the silent witness. Let reality perform its little charade. Let the loop, on the wall of a cave. Who knows, it sits all just, convincingly stitched shadows, you were never truly trapped in. You stir not broken. Reality isn't set broken, until you stop pretending you don't notice. It steps just that everything is pretending to work,